Section 1. The show that ate fame alive. There is a town in America that does not appear on any map. It has no fixed state, no confirmed zip code, no verified coordinates. It sits somewhere between the mountains and the ocean and the heartland and the desert, borrowing geography from everywhere and belonging to nowhere. The people who live there have yellow skin and four fingers on each hand, and eyes that bulge slightly, as though they have been mildly surprised every single day of their lives. Nobody in this town ages. Nobody grows old. Nobody moves on. The children are always the same age they were in 1989, and the adults are always somewhere in that soft, indeterminate middle stretch of life where you are old enough to have a mortgage but young enough to still believe things might get better. The town is called Springfield, and for 36 years it has been the most dangerous place in the world to be famous. Not dangerous in the way you might first imagine. Springfield will not physically harm you, not most of the time. It will not arrest you or bankrupt you or send you away in disgrace. What Springfield does is something quieter and in some ways far more devastating. It takes famous people. Real, living, breathing famous people with careers and reputations and carefully maintained public images built over years of hard work and calculated performances. And it distills them down to a single joke, a punchline, a version of themselves so compressed, so simplified, so ruthlessly efficient in its reduction that by the time Springfield is done with you, you will have permanently become the cartoon version of yourself in the minds of millions of people, whether you wanted that or not. Think about what it means to appear on The Simpsons. Not in the abstract, not as a career milestone, but in the specific mechanical sense of what the show actually does to the people it invites inside. You arrive in Springfield as the full, complicated, multi-dimensional human being that you have spent your entire career presenting to the world. You have your persona, you have your brand, you have the version of yourself that the public has agreed to accept. And the writers of The Simpsons look at all of that, look at every carefully constructed element of your public identity, and they find the one thread that unravels it all. The one thing about you that is funny, not because it is untrue, but precisely because it is true. The one detail, the one habit, the one reputation, the one widely held perception that you yourself might prefer people did not focus on. And they pull that thread, slowly, gently, with remarkable craft, until the whole sweater comes apart in their hands and everybody watching can see exactly what it was made of. Over 36 seasons, across 788 episodes, The Simpsons has done this to hundreds of people. Musicians, athletes, actors, politicians, talk show hosts, authors, scientists, comedians, royalty. People who were at the absolute peak of their cultural power. People who had nothing left to prove. People who thought, reasonably, that appearing on a beloved animated sitcom would be a charming and harmless addition to an already impressive legacy. And in some cases, they were right. Some guests came to Springfield, did their episode, and emerged on the other side with their reputations not just intact, but enhanced, burnished by the encounter, made somehow more real and more human by the fact they were willing to be laughed at on a Sunday night in front of 20 million people. But others did not fare so well. This is a story about both kinds. This is a slow, careful, story-shaped walk through every significant celebrity that The Simpsons invited into its universe over the course of its remarkable and endless run. What the show did to them, what they brought to the show, what happened to their careers and their reputations and their public images in the years that followed, and what it tells us about the strange, complicated, sometimes surprisingly dark relationship between fame and satire, between celebrity culture and the one television show that spent 36 years holding a funhouse mirror up to both. Get comfortable. Pull a blanket over your shoulders if you need one. Let the light in the room go soft. Because this is a long story, told gently, and there is no reason to rush through it. Let us start at the very beginning of the relationship between Springfield and the famous people who passed through it. When The Simpsons debuted in December of 1989, the idea of a major celebrity appearing on an animated sitcom was genuinely unusual. Animation was broadly considered a medium for children. The shows that dominated the form were either Saturday morning cartoons aimed at kids or primetime specials that used their animated format as a deliberate aesthetic choice rather than a storytelling vehicle. Live action was where serious entertainment happened. Live action was where careers were made and reputations were managed and cultural conversations were conducted. The idea that a real, working, respected celebrity would lend their voice to a cartoon, allow themselves to be drawn as a yellow four-fingered caricature, and submit their carefully maintained image to the mercy of a writer's room was not quite respectable in the way it would later become. The Simpsons changed that. It changed it so completely and so quickly that within a few years, appearing on the show had become not just acceptable but desirable, an indicator of cultural relevance. A signal that you were the kind of person who did not take yourself so seriously that you could not laugh at yourself, which in the early 1990s was one of the most valuable things a celebrity could communicate to the public. The first significant celebrity guest appearances established a template that the show would follow and refine and occasionally subvert for the next 3.5 decades. The template was elegant in its simplicity. You bring in someone famous. You place that famous person in a situation where their fame is both the joke and the point. You have them engage with the Simpson family in a way that reveals something true about both the celebrity and about the Simpsons, about the way ordinary people interact with extraordinary people, about what fame looks like from the outside and what it costs from the inside. And then you let the animators do what animators do, which is to strip away everything unnecessary and leave only the essential shape of a person, rendered in yellow and expressed in four fingers. What makes the show's approach to celebrity remarkable, and what separates its best guest appearances from the merely competent ones, is that it never treats famous people as simply props. The worst celebrity cameos on television are essentially elaborate branding exercises, moments where a famous person appears in a show to remind you that they exist and that you like them. The celebrity smiles. The celebrity delivers a line written for a regular character. The celebrity waves goodbye. Nobody is changed by the experience. Nobody learns anything. The celebrity remains exactly as famous as they were before, neither more nor less. The Simpsons is not interested in that transaction. The show at its best is interested in what famous people are actually like, not what their publicists say they are like, not what their social media presence suggests they are like. What they are actually like when you strip away the machinery of celebrity and put them in a room with a man who eats donuts for breakfast and a family that lives paycheck to paycheck in a town that is quietly being poisoned by its own power plant. What does fame mean in that context? What does it look like when it is honest about what it is? Some celebrities understood this instinctively. They came to the show with their guard down, willing to be the version of themselves that was unflattering and specific and actually interesting. These are the appearances that people still talk about decades later. These are the moments when The Simpsons and a guest performed together in a way that felt genuinely alive. And some celebrities came to the show with their defenses up, unwilling to be reduced, unwilling to be made smaller than they believed themselves to be. And the writers, gently but firmly, made them smaller anyway. Because that is what Springfield does. Springfield does not respect the machinery of fame. Springfield only respects what is real. Over the course of the next several hours, we are going to move through the most significant of these encounters. We will take them slowly, one by one, with the care that each of them deserves. We will talk about what the show did and what the show meant and what happened afterward, and what all of it tells us about the strange economy of celebrity in the age of a television show that has been running longer than most celebrities' entire careers. There will be moments in this telling that are funny. There will be moments that are genuinely sad. There will be moments that feel unfair, and moments that feel exactly as fair as they should be. There will be stories about people who got more from Springfield than they gave, and stories about people who gave everything and got almost nothing back, and stories about people who were so thoroughly absorbed by the show's version of them that the original version became almost impossible to remember. But before we get to any of that, we need to talk about the guest appearance that sits at the center of all of this. The one that the show itself could never quite make official. The one where a man who was at the time the most famous human being on the planet walked into Springfield, left a piece of himself there, and the show spent years pretending it had not happened. We need to talk about Michael Jackson, because the Michael Jackson story is not just a story about a celebrity appearance. It is a story about the limits of what fame can protect you from, about the strange democracy of satire, and about the one instance in the long history of The Simpsons where the show's relationship with celebrity became genuinely complicated in ways that the writers themselves could not fully control or contain. And it is a story that changed the show forever, even if the show spent years refusing to admit it. Before we go any further into Michael Jackson's story, which is long and strange and deserves its own careful telling, let us pause here for just a moment. If you are watching this late at night or early in the morning or at some quiet hour when the rest of your house is still, drop a comment below and tell us where you are. Tell us what time it is there. Tell us what the light looks like outside your window or whether the blinds are drawn, or whether you are watching this from under a blanket with your phone held above your face. There are people watching this from every corner of the world, at every hour of the day, and knowing you are out there, knowing the coordinates of this particular moment, in the particular place where you are resting, makes this feel like less of a broadcast and more of a conversation. And if you have not subscribed yet, now is a good time. The subscribe button is right there. It takes 1 second, and it means you will be here for the next one. All right, let us go back to Springfield. Let us go back to 1991. Let us talk about a man named John J. Smith. Section 2. Michael Jackson and the Ghost in Cell Block. D. In the spring of 1991, Michael Jackson was not merely famous. He was a category unto himself. He had released Thriller in 1982, and in the years since, the album had sold somewhere in the neighborhood of 66 million copies, a number so large it exists less as a statistic and more as a philosophical statement about the nature of human desire and collective experience. He had released Bad in 1987 and watched it produce 5 consecutive #1 singles in America, a record that had never been achieved before and has not been matched since. He was the most decorated recording artist in the history of popular music at that point. His face was on the cover of every magazine that mattered. His performances were events that people organized their entire lives around attending. Governments invited him to visit. Heads of state arranged meetings. And he wanted to be on The Simpsons. The story of how this came about is itself a piece of pop culture history that has been told and retold and refined over the years into something approaching legend, though the essential facts remain intact and strange enough to need no embellishment. Michael Jackson called the producers of The Simpsons. He made contact through the appropriate channels, the way a person does when they want something but also want to make clear that the wanting is gracious rather than desperate. He expressed his interest. The producers, Al Jean and Mike Rice and Matt Groening and the rest of the team, were understandably somewhat startled by this. Not skeptical exactly, but careful. Because Michael Jackson's participation in anything by 1991 was not a simple matter of showing up and doing a thing. Michael Jackson's participation in anything was a negotiation, a production, an event. There were layers to it. There were conditions attached. And the condition that Jackson attached to his appearance on The Simpsons was the one that would make the whole enterprise so strange, and so interesting, and so endlessly discussed in the years that followed. He would do the episode, he would voice the character, he would deliver the lines and perform the comedy and participate fully in the creative process. But he would not do it as Michael Jackson, he would do it as a pseudonym. His name would appear in the credits in the episode in all official materials as John J. Smith. If anyone asked whether Michael Jackson was on The Simpsons, the producers would say no. If the voice sounded exactly like Michael Jackson, well, that was a coincidence. That was just John J. Smith, an ordinary man with an extraordinarily familiar voice, doing some voice acting. The episode was called Stark Raving Dad. It aired on September 19th, 1991, in the 3rd season. And it is one of the strangest and most beautiful pieces of television that the show has ever produced. The premise begins with Homer. Homer has accidentally worn a pink shirt to work, and because the nuclear power plant has a strict white shirt policy that Homer did not know about, Burns assumes this is an act of protest, a deliberate act of nonconformity, and sends Homer to a mental institution for psychological evaluation. This is a very Simpsons thing to happen. Homer ends up places because of a chain of small misunderstandings and poor decisions that accumulate into situations no reasonable person could have anticipated. The mental institution is fine by Homer. It has a clean bed and regular meals. Homer has been in worse situations. In the institution, Homer is assigned a roommate. a large, heavy-set white man who calmly and confidently introduces himself as Michael Jackson. He says it the way you might say any name, casually, without drama. This is who he is. And Homer, being Homer, sees no reason to doubt this. To Homer, it is entirely plausible that the real Michael Jackson might be sharing a room with him in a mental institution. Things happen. The voice coming from this character is, without any real ambiguity, the voice of Michael Jackson. Or rather, it is the voice of a man doing an extraordinarily convincing impression of Michael Jackson, which is what the show and its lawyers and its publicity department maintained for years, even as everyone watching knew perfectly well what they were hearing. The voice has that particular quality that Jackson's voice had in conversation, different from his singing voice, softer and more uncertain, with a gentleness to it that always seemed slightly at odds with the scale of his fame. But here is what makes Stark Raving Dad remarkable as a piece of television, as opposed to merely remarkable as a celebrity stunt. The episode uses the Michael Jackson character, the large white man who believes he is Michael Jackson and who sounds exactly like him, to tell a story about fame and desire and the gap between who famous people actually are and who we need them to be. The man in the institution is not the real Michael Jackson. He might be delusional, he might be performing, he might be telling a kind of truth that is different from the literal truth, the way someone might claim to be Napoleon. Not because they believe it in the clinical sense, but because Napoleon represents something they need to inhabit. And Homer, who is perhaps the last person on Earth who should be the vehicle for this kind of insight, does not care about any of that. Homer does not care whether his roommate is the real Michael Jackson or not. Homer just likes him. He is kind. He is interesting. He has something to say about the world. And that is enough for Homer, who has never been particularly impressed by fame as a concept, but is always moved by genuine human warmth. There is a subplot in this episode about Lisa's birthday. Homer has forgotten it, which is not unusual for Homer. And as the episode develops, the Michael Jackson character helps Homer write a song for Lisa. A birthday song, a small and personal piece of music with no larger ambition than to make one 8-year-old girl feel seen and loved by her father. And the song, when it comes, is genuinely sweet. It is not attempting to be a great song. It does not have any of the spectacular pyrotechnics of Jackson's actual catalog. It is just a simple melody about a father who sees his daughter clearly and wants her to know it. The moment when Lisa hears the song and begins to cry, not from sadness, but from the specific kind of overwhelmed feeling that comes when someone you love shows you that they have been paying attention, that they have been watching you and knowing you and carrying a quiet tenderness for you all along, is one of the show's genuine emotional peaks. It works because everything around it has been built with care. Because the episode has earned that moment. Because Homer's failure as a father throughout the episode makes his success at the end feel like something real rather than something written. And Michael Jackson, or John J. Smith, or whoever was in that recording booth speaking those lines, understood exactly what the episode was trying to do. He did not treat it as a celebrity cameo, he treated it as an acting job. He brought the full weight of his attention to the material and delivered a performance that was genuinely affecting in a way that voice acting on a cartoon rarely is. The episode is widely considered one of the greatest in the show's history. It won awards. It was cited by critics as evidence of what animated television could accomplish. Matt Groening has called it one of his favorite episodes ever made. And for 27 years, the show maintained the fiction of John J. Smith. Michael Jackson was not in this episode. It was just a guy with a very familiar voice. In 2019, everything changed. The documentary Leaving Neverland aired on HBO. It was 4 hours long. It contained detailed allegations of sexual abuse against Michael Jackson from two men who had been children when they knew him, Wade Robson and James Safechuck. The allegations were specific and harrowing, and the documentary presented them with a methodical seriousness that made them impossible to dismiss or look away from. The cultural conversation about Michael Jackson's legacy shifted immediately and dramatically. And the producers of The Simpsons made a decision. They pulled Stark Raving Dad from circulation. The episode was removed from streaming platforms. It was removed from syndication packages. It was removed from the official episode library. It became, functionally, a ghost. An episode that existed in memory and in old recordings and in the cultural record, but that the show itself would no longer actively present as part of its canon. Al Jean, the executive producer, was direct about the reasoning. The allegations were serious enough that continuing to feature the episode, continuing to treat the Michael Jackson connection as a charming piece of trivia, felt wrong. Not legally wrong, not contractually wrong, morally wrong. The episode had been made with love and had accomplished something genuinely beautiful, and none of that changed the nature of what was being alleged about the man whose voice made it possible. James L. Brooks, one of the show's creators, was quoted as saying that the decision felt like the only choice available to people of conscience. The episode does not officially exist anymore, though, of course, it does exist because nothing that has been seen by that many people ever truly disappears. It lives on bootleg servers and personal hard drives, and the memories of everyone who watched it when it aired and felt something real when Lisa started to cry. It is simultaneously one of the most erased and one of the most discussed episodes in the show's history. What does this story tell us in the context of a video about every celebrity that The Simpsons destroyed? It tells us something complicated and worth sitting with for a moment. The Simpsons did not destroy Michael Jackson. Whatever happened to Michael Jackson's reputation in the years after Stark Raving Dad aired has nothing to do with the episode itself or with the show's treatment of him. The episode treated him with something that looks, from this distance, remarkably like gentleness. It took the mythological weight of his fame and set it aside entirely, and in its place put a man who wanted to help a stranger write a birthday song for his daughter. It stripped away the spectacle and the controversy and the sheer magnitude of what Michael Jackson meant to popular culture and found something small and human underneath. That might be the kindest thing The Simpsons ever did to anyone. But the aftermath, the erasure, the pulling of the episode, the official pretense that it does not exist, the specific awkwardness that comes with trying to discuss it now, all of that is its own form of damage. The episode has been disappeared not because of anything the show did, but because of who was in it. Michael Jackson's presence in Springfield, even rendered pseudonymous, even rendered in animation, even rendered gentle and warm and devoted to making a little girl happy, carries a weight now that the people who made the episode could not have anticipated. The show that never lets anyone age, the show where time does not pass and consequences do not stick, drew a permanent line around this one episode and said that this one thing does not get to reset. This one thing stays gone. That is a different kind of destruction than the show usually practices. Usually, when Springfield takes a piece of a celebrity and remakes it into something smaller, the celebrity is still there on the other side, unchanged in the important ways, perhaps slightly more self-aware. With Michael Jackson, the show tried to give something back and ended up holding something it could not return and could not keep. Stark Raving Dad is the episode that proves that Springfield is not actually a safe place after all. It is a place where the real world can reach in and take things, and where the things it takes stay taken, and where the line between comedy and tragedy is thin enough that even the most loving piece of work can become impossible to look at directly. We will carry this story with us as we move through the rest of Springfield's relationship with fame. Because it sets something important, that the show's treatment of celebrity is not always clean, not always simple, not always resolved by the end of the episode. Sometimes a guest comes to Springfield and leaves a stain that nobody knew was coming, and sometimes the stain is not on them but on the show itself, and on the culture that produced both of them and is still trying to figure out what to do with the residue. Now let us move somewhere lighter, let us move somewhere loud and electric, and dressed in a great deal of leather. Let us go back to the early 1990s and talk about the night that the most successful rock band in the world came to Springfield, and the show found a way to make them seem both more and less than they were, sometimes in the same scene. Let us talk about Aerosmith. Section 3. Rock and Roll and the Town That Ate It. Aerosmith arrived in Springfield in the 5th season, in an episode called Homer's Barbershop Quartet, which aired in September of 1993. Except, that is not quite right, because the Aerosmith connection is more complicated than a single episode appearance, and the broader story of rock music in The Simpsons is a thread that runs through the show's entire history in ways that reveal something interesting about how the show understood celebrity in the context of popular music. But let us start with Aerosmith, because Aerosmith is a particularly good case study in what happens when a band has cultivated a specific kind of mythology and then hands that mythology over to a team of writers who are fundamentally unimpressed by mythology. By 1993, Aerosmith was one of the most successful bands in the history of rock music. They had been together since 1970. They had survived the excess and collapse of the 1970s, during which the original band members had developed substance problems serious enough to nearly destroy the group entirely. They had come back in the mid-1980s, cleaner and sharper and somehow more compelling for having been through the destruction and come out the other side. They had released Permanent Vacation in 1987 and Pump in 1989, both of which were enormous commercial successes, and their collaboration with Run DMC on the remake of Walk This Way in 1986 had placed them at the center of a cultural conversation about the intersection of rock and hip-hop that was genuinely significant. They were, in short, a band with a mythology, a band with a story, a band that had earned its place in the cultural imagination through a combination of genuine talent and spectacular suffering and remarkable recovery. And they were, as of 1993, a band that was willing to appear on The Simpsons. The appearance itself was a product of a specific early 90s cultural moment when rock stars were discovering that irony was a valid mode of self-presentation. The alternative rock movement had made earnestness complicated and self-seriousness slightly embarrassing. And bands like Aerosmith, who had always leaned toward the theatrical and the grand, were finding that one way to stay culturally relevant was to demonstrate that you understood the joke of your own excess. That you were not merely a rock band, you were aware of the concept of rock bands, and you found it as amusing as anyone else. The Simpsons, which by its fifth season had established itself as perhaps the most irony-fluent show on American television, was a natural home for this kind of self-awareness. In the episode that became known as the Aerosmith episode, the band appears as a kind of Greek chorus to the main story, which involves Homer forming a barbershop quartet in a parody of Beatles mythology. The band members, rendered in the show's characteristic animation style, appear at a bar called Moe's, which is where much of Springfield's male social life happens, and they engage in the kind of casual, low-stakes interaction that the show does best. Nobody treats them as special. The bartender does not fawn over them. Homer, predictably, does not recognize them. The band drinks beer and talks and allows themselves to be furniture in somebody else's story. This is actually the most effective thing the show can do to a rock band of Aerosmith's stature. Not mock them, not parody their specific songs or their specific biography. Just put them in Moe's bar and let them have a beer. Because what that accomplishes with a kind of elegant economy is the suggestion that fame does not change the fundamental shape of a human life. Steven Tyler and Joe Perry and the rest of them, stripped of their stage presence and their lighting rigs and their carefully maintained rock star personas, are just people sitting at a bar on a Thursday afternoon. Just like the rest of Springfield. Just like Homer. The band understood this. They participated with evident good humor. They voiced themselves, which was a detail that mattered to the authenticity of the appearance, and they delivered their lines with the kind of relaxed self-deprecation that comes from being comfortable enough in your own mythology that you do not need to defend it. But the broader story of rock music and The Simpsons is worth telling more slowly, because the show's relationship with rock and roll over its entire run is a kind of compressed history of popular music and celebrity, and the celebrities who pass through it in musical form are an important part of the story we are telling here. Let us go back to where rock music and Springfield first truly intersected in a meaningful way. Let us go back to 1995. The episode is called Homerpalooza, and it aired in May of 1996 in the 7th season. The cultural context for this episode is important. In 1994, Kurt Cobain had died, and grunge had begun its transition from musical movement to cultural memory. In 1991, Lollapalooza had launched as a traveling festival and had spent several years being the dominant live music event in American alternative rock culture. By 1996, both of these things, Cobain and Lollapalooza, were already becoming the kind of cultural touchstones that people referenced with a mixture of affection and slight unease. The show took both and made them into something that walks the line between tribute and takedown with remarkable balance. In Homerpalooza, Homer discovers that his musical taste Frozen in the 1970s in an era of rock music that his children find embarrassingly ancient has made him fundamentally incomprehensible to his own teenagers. He is, culturally speaking, obsolete. This is a theme the show returns to often with Homer, the sense of a man who is always slightly behind the moment, always reaching for references that have already passed their expiration date, always standing just outside the circle of whatever is currently mattering. Homer tries to prove his cultural relevance by going to a music festival modeled very closely on Lollapalooza. The bands featured in the episode include Cypress Hill, Smashing Pumpkins, and Sonic Youth. These were not fringe bands. These were not obscure choices designed to signal the writer's indie credibility. These were some of the most significant bands in American alternative music at the time, bands with genuine cultural weight and critical standing and large devoted audiences. And the episode treats them with a specific kind of affection that is different from the treatment it gives Homer. Homer, being Homer, accidentally becomes a sideshow attraction. He can withstand the impact of a cannonball to the stomach, a talent discovered by chance that the festival quickly monetizes. He is not a musician. He has no place in this world. But he desperately wants one because he desperately wants to believe that the culture he loves still has room for him. The Smashing Pumpkins sequence is one of the most discussed in the episode's history. Billy Corgan and the other band members are shown backstage where they engage in a conversation about the profound meaninglessness of human existence, specifically in the context of a Smashing Pumpkins concert. This is a gentle but precise observation about the band's particular relationship with cosmic despair, which was indeed a significant part of their public identity at the time. They were serious. They were committed to the emotional weight of their work. They wore their existential concerns openly and without apology. And putting that earnestness in a Springfield backstage area surrounded by the particular texture of the show's world makes it funny in a way that is simultaneously affectionate and slightly deflating. Not because the earnestness is wrong, not because the despair is fake, but because placed in that context, it reveals itself as a performance, as a persona, as a thing that has been constructed with care and maintained with effort. Which is exactly what all earnestness is, of course. All of us are performing our own sincerity. The Simpsons just makes that visible. Billy Corgan and the band agreed to voice themselves. Corgan's delivery is characteristically serious, which is exactly right. He is not winking at the audience. He is playing the version of himself that exists in the cultural imagination, the version that is deeply and sincerely committed to the profound sadness of everything. The joke works because he commits to it fully. Sonic Youth's appearance in the same episode is briefer, but equally pointed. The band, who by 1996 had been making challenging and critically respected noise rock for roughly 15 years, are shown engaging in an argument about the precise tuning of their guitars, a conversation that becomes increasingly technical and esoteric, and finally disappears into a kind of conceptual art fog. This is not unfair. Sonic Youth's music, which was genuinely radical and genuinely influential, was also genuinely difficult to access for casual listeners, and the episode acknowledges this without turning it into a criticism. They are not mocked for being inaccessible. They are simply depicted as a band whose internal conversation operates at a frequency slightly outside the range of ordinary comprehension. Cypress Hill's segment, which involves the band accidentally booking the London Symphony Orchestra to perform with them, is the most structurally absurd of the three musical moments in the episode. The premise is built around a scheduling confusion that results in an entirely inappropriate pairing of musical acts. But here is the remarkable thing about this particular joke. In 2024, Cypress Hill performed with the London Symphony Orchestra at the Royal Albert Hall. The joke in the episode, the joke that the show thought of as a pure absurdist gag with no particular connection to reality, actually happened, roughly 28 years after the episode aired. This is one of those prediction stories that the show accumulates so effortlessly. And like all the best prediction stories, it is not really a prediction. It is a piece of satire that happened to intersect with a piece of reality at a later point. The joke worked in 1996 because the idea of Cypress Hill and a symphony orchestra was inherently incongruous, because the gap between those two things was wide enough to be funny. The fact that the gap eventually got bridged says something interesting about the arc of cultural history. about the way that things that seem incongruous in one decade seem entirely natural in another. But it does not make The Simpsons prophetic. It makes them observant, which is a different thing, though in certain lights it can look the same. Let us now move from Homer Palooza to a different kind of rock and roll story, one that is less about bands and more about a specific individual, and one that illustrates the other side of what Springfield can do to a musician. In the 8th season, in an episode called El Viaje Misterioso de Nuestro Homer, which aired in January of 1997, Johnny Cash voiced the role of a talking coyote who appears to Homer in a chili pepper-induced spirit vision. Homer has eaten an extremely potent pepper at the Springfield chili cook-off and entered a hallucinatory state in which he wanders through a dreamlike version of the desert, guided by a wise and gentle coyote who speaks with the voice of Johnny Cash. This appearance is not a parody. It is not a joke about Johnny Cash specifically or about the things he represented or the kind of career he had. It is something much stranger and much more interesting. It is a piece of genuine magical realism inside a comedy cartoon. And it works because Johnny Cash's voice carries the weight that the scene needs. By 1997, Johnny Cash was in the later stages of one of the most remarkable career arcs in popular music history. He had spent decades as a country music institution, had gone through his own wilderness years, and was in the middle of what would become his final creative period. A series of recordings with producer Rick Rubin that would ultimately include some of the most powerful and affecting work of his entire career. His voice, by this point, had the quality of something that has been worn smooth by use, deep and weathered and carrying within it the specific gravity of a life that has been fully and thoroughly lived. The show placed that voice in the mouth of a spirit animal and sent it to walk with Homer through a desert that exists only in the space between unconsciousness and waking. And Cash, characteristically, treated the assignment with complete sincerity. There is no ironic distance in his performance. He is not winking at the audience or acknowledging the inherent strangeness of Johnny Cash voicing a cartoon coyote. He simply delivers the lines as though the lines deserve to be delivered well, with care, with the same weight he would give to anything. The result is one of the genuinely transcendent moments in the show's history. Not because it is funny, though there are funny moments around it, but because it is beautiful. Because it uses animation to do something that live action would struggle with, to create a visual world for an interior emotional experience, and it uses Cash's voice as the anchor that makes that world feel real. The Simpsons did not destroy Johnny Cash. It gave him one of his most unexpected and most beloved legacies outside of music. People who have never heard a Johnny Cash record still know his coyote, still associate that voice with a particular kind of wisdom, with the long view, with the suggestion that even the most confused and directionless journey has a destination if you are patient enough to walk toward it. That is not destruction. That is a form of preservation, a form of tribute. The show found the most essential thing about what Johnny Cash meant in the cultural imagination and let it inhabit, briefly, the strange dream world of Homer Simpson. But not every musician got the coyote treatment. Not every musician got Johnny Cash's quiet dignity in the desert. Some musicians came to Springfield and got something much more uncomfortable. Let us talk about Paul McCartney. Paul McCartney's appearance in The Simpsons is a fascinating case study in how the show handles musicians who come with a very specific and very carefully maintained public image. McCartney appeared in the show in the 7th season, in an episode called Lisa the Vegetarian, which aired in October of 1995. His wife at the time, Linda McCartney, appeared alongside him. The episode is built around Lisa's decision to stop eating meat, a decision that puts her at odds with her family and with the broader culture of Springfield, which treats the consumption of large quantities of animal protein as both a civic and a personal virtue. The show's treatment of the vegetarianism storyline is notably genuine. It does not mock Lisa's decision. It does not present her choice as the punchline of a joke about teenage earnestness or naive idealism. It takes the ethical questions seriously enough to build an entire episode around them, and it allows Lisa's position to have real weight, to actually matter within the story. And the McCartneys, who were by 1995 significant figures in the vegetarian movement and animal rights advocacy, appear at the end of the episode to essentially validate Lisa's choice. They are on the roof of Apu's convenience store, the Quickie Mart, tending a garden. They are gentle and warm and speak about their beliefs with quiet conviction. It is one of the most interesting celebrity appearances in the show's history because it is one of the most explicitly ideological. Paul and Linda McCartney did not simply appear because they were famous. They appeared because the episode was about something they believed in, and their presence was meant to communicate that belief in the specific idiom of the show. Paul McCartney attached a condition to his appearance. He would participate only if the show committed to never having Lisa eat meat again, and the writers agreed. And they kept the agreement. Lisa Simpson, across 36 seasons and hundreds of subsequent episodes, has remained a vegetarian. Paul McCartney's guest appearance literally and permanently changed the moral landscape of the show. This is a different kind of celebrity appearance than anything else in the show's history. McCartney came not as a fan or as a fellow traveler in the world of entertainment, but as a representative of a position, and he used the leverage of his fame to extract a commitment from the writers, and the writers honored that commitment for the rest of the show's existence. He did not get a one-episode arc or a single scene. He got a lasting change. That is a kind of power that very few guests ever manage to exercise over Springfield. Springfield eats things and digests them and moves on, generally leaving the things it has eaten slightly less imposing than they were before. McCartney came in and left a mark that the show could not absorb or minimize. He left a principle behind, written into the structure of the show itself, in the DNA of one of its characters. Is that destruction? Is that what we are talking about when we talk about what Springfield does to famous people? In McCartney's case, no. In McCartney's case, the show met its guest as an equal, and the guest used that equality to plant a flag that has never been taken down. But Linda McCartney died in 1998, 3 years after the episode aired. And when she died, the roof garden scene and the quiet warmth of her appearance in that episode became something more than a cameo. It became a small memorial, a piece of her that the show had preserved, unchanging in its amber. Springfield, which does not age and does not change and does not allow time to pass, kept Linda McCartney exactly as she was in 1995, gentle and smiling and tending her garden above a convenience store, forever. That is the strangest gift that Springfield has to give. Not mockery, not reduction, just preservation. Freezing a moment in time so that it can be returned to over and over, exactly as it was. We will return to this idea later. We will return to it when we talk about Phil Hartman. But first, let us spend some time with Homer in Hollywood. Let us look at what happens when the show goes to the entertainment industry itself and finds the celebrities who live there in their natural habitat and examines them with the same level of care it gives to everything else. Because the Hollywood episodes, the episodes where Springfield intersects directly with the machinery of the entertainment industry, are some of the most precise pieces of celebrity observation the show has ever produced, and the famous people who pass through them are some of the most thoroughly and accurately rendered. Let us talk about what Homer found when he went to the place where fame is manufactured. Section 4. Homer Goes to Hollywood. There is a particular pleasure in watching a show built around a working-class family turn its attention toward the world of celebrity and wealth. The Simpsons does this regularly, and when it does it well, it achieves something that few satires manage, which is to be accurate about its targets without being cruel to them, and to be sympathetic to its central characters without being sentimental about their limitations. The episodes in which The Simpsons engages directly with Hollywood, with the entertainment industry, with the culture of celebrity production and celebrity consumption, form a subset of the show's catalog that is worth examining as a group. Not because they all handle celebrity in the same way, but because they share a consistent underlying perspective, which is that fame is a product. Fame is manufactured. Fame requires maintenance, and the machinery required to produce and maintain it is often more interesting than the fame itself. Let us start with the episode that is, by common consensus, the show's most pointed examination of the entertainment industry. Krusty Gets Cancelled, which aired in the 4th season in May of 1993, is technically not a celebrity episode in the usual sense. It does not feature a single guest star dropping in to play a version of themselves. What it features is something more interesting, which is a fictionalized examination of what happens when a celebrity's cultural relevance begins to fade. Krusty the Clown is a recurring character in the show, Homer's childhood hero, a television entertainer of the old school variety, a man whose career was built in an era when television had three channels and the children's entertainment space was dominated by broad, physical comedy and cheerful dishonesty about products. By the time we get to the fourth season, Krusty is already slightly behind the moment. His show is successful but not dominant. His cultural authority is real but not uncontested. The threat to Krusty in this episode comes in the form of Gabbo, a ventriloquist's dummy with a new television show that immediately and completely dominates the Springfield entertainment market. Krusty's ratings collapse. His show is canceled. And the episode becomes a meditation on what it means to be famous in a world that is continuously producing new famous things. The celebrity cameos in Krusty Gets Canceled are numerous and deliberate. Johnny Carson, Luke Perry, Elizabeth Taylor, Bette Midler, Hugh Hefner, Barry White, Red Hot Chili Peppers. All of them appear to help Krusty stage a comeback special, and the episode's handling of this material is instructive. The celebrities do not simply appear and wave. They are used to make a specific point about the transactional nature of celebrity relationships, about how fame at a certain level creates a network of mutual obligations, about how the entertainment industry is built on favors and reciprocity, and the shared understanding that everyone in it is only as valuable as their last successful project. Johnny Carson's appearance is the most historically interesting because it came near the end of his run as the host of The Tonight Show, which he had occupied for 30 years and which he was about to leave permanently. Carson, who was famously private and famously selective about his public appearances in the years after his retirement, agreed to voice himself in a brief segment. His presence in the episode, in retrospect, has the quality of a farewell, a last public appearance in animated form from a man who was about to withdraw almost entirely from public life. The show uses Carson exactly right. It does not try to mine his career for jokes. It does not reduce him to a punchline or a caricature. It simply allows him to be himself, the dignified, funny, slightly formal entertainer that the public had loved for decades, dropped briefly into Springfield as evidence of the kind of cultural capital that Krusty once had and is trying to recover. But the episode is ultimately not about any of its celebrity guests. It is about Krusty. It is about what happens to a person whose identity is built entirely around their public self when that public self is no longer wanted. Krusty, after his show is canceled, goes through a kind of dissolution. Without the show, he does not know what he is. The trappings of celebrity, the fame, the recognition, the ability to enter a room and have that room change, simply because he has entered it. These things have become so essential to a sense of self that their absence is not just professionally devastating. It is existentially threatening. This is one of the most accurate things The Simpsons has ever said about fame. Not the explicit things it says, not through dialogue or plot, but through the accumulation of detail in how Krusty is drawn in the aftermath of his cancellation. The specific slump of his shoulders, the way the makeup seems less precise than it used to be, the sense that without an audience to perform for, the performance never quite stops but also never quite lands. Fame as addiction. Fame as identity. Fame as the only thing standing between a person and the question of who they are without it. The real celebrities who appear in this episode are, in a sense, props in Krusty's story. They exist to help him recover his relevance, and in doing so, they illuminate something about relevance itself, about the way cultural capital flows between people, about how being associated with still famous things can restore the faded fame of previously famous things. The Red Hot Chili Peppers appear and are treated as warm and unpretentious, which by 1993 was an accurate observation about their public persona. They had a specific kind of rock and roll accessibility, a sense that they were genuinely delighted by being in rooms with people, that they liked their fans with something approaching real affection rather than performative gratitude. The show captures this with a few brief strokes. They are happy to be there. They do not need to be handled. They just show up and play. Bette Midler's appearance is more interesting because it is more complicated. Midler had by 1993 established herself as a particular kind of entertainment institution, a performer whose work spanned multiple genres and whose cultural presence was defined as much by her wit and her self-awareness as by any single creative achievement. The show uses her with a specific kind of affection that acknowledges her intelligence while also gently deflating her grand gestures. She is committed to goodness in the episode, to helping Krusty not because of professional obligation, but because she is genuinely kind, and the show treats that kindness as both real and slightly absurd. The genuine kindness of a famous person is always slightly absurd in Springfield, because Springfield understands that kindness at scale, kindness that is communicated through the medium of celebrity, is still a performance, however sincere it might be. Hugh Hefner's presence in the episode is the most curious, in retrospect, because the cultural conversation about Hefner has shifted so dramatically in the decades since the episode aired, that his brief cheerful cameo now reads very differently than it did in 1993. In 1993, Hefner was a figure of mild cultural satire, a man whose excesses were well known and widely reported, but who occupied a space in the public imagination that was broadly associated with a certain kind of cheerful libertinism. He was the man in the robe. He was the mansion. He was a slightly comical figure rather than a troubling one. The cultural reassessment of Hefner that has occurred in the years since, driven by documentary investigations and first-hand accounts from women who were connected to the Playboy enterprise, has made his cameo difficult to watch without a different kind of discomfort. The show did nothing wrong in including him. In 1993, by the standards of the culture that produced the show, he was a reasonable choice. But time does what time does to reputations, and the grinning, robe-wearing version of Hefner that appears in Krusty Gets Cancelled now sits uncomfortably in the episode, a reminder that the culture's sense of who is funny and who is troubling is not fixed and not reliable and can shift dramatically over decades. This is a pattern we will see again in this story. The Simpsons has been running long enough that several of its guests have had their reputations revised, either upward or downward, in the years since their appearances. And the show, which never ages, which never updates its episodes to reflect new information, preserves them in the state they were in when they were animated. It is a kind of accidental time capsule, not just of what celebrities were famous for, but of how the culture felt about them at a particular moment in history. Let us move now to one of the most specific and most interesting celebrity encounters in the show's history, one that involves not a single celebrity but an entire industry, and one that reveals something important about how The Simpsons handles the relationship between art and commerce. The episode is called Itchy and Scratchy and Marge, and it aired in the second season in December of 1990. It is technically not a celebrity episode, but it is a celebrity industry episode. It is an episode about cultural production, about the relationship between entertainment and violence, about the question of what responsibility artists have for the effects of their work. And it does something that very few episodes of any show have done, which is to make both sides of an argument appear simultaneously correct. But the episode that is most relevant to our larger story about Hollywood and celebrity is Homer Badman, which aired in the fifth season in November of 1994. This episode is about the machinery of celebrity scandal, about what happens when the media apparatus that produces and sustains fame turns against a person, how quickly a reputation can be destroyed by the manufacture of a narrative, how helpless even relatively innocent people can be in the face of a story that the culture has decided to tell about them. Homer, characteristically, stumbles into a situation that he does not understand, and that spins wildly out of his control. He attends a candy convention, obtains a rare piece of candy, and on the way home grabs at the candy, which happens to be stuck to the back of the pants of a babysitter who is also in the car. She interprets this as an act of harassment. The story reaches the media. The media, which in this episode is depicted with a precision that looks remarkably prophetic, given what the media environment would become in the decades after 1994, seizes on the story and amplifies it without regard for accuracy, nuance, or Homer's actual guilt or innocence. The episode features a fictional documentary filmmaker played by an uncredited voice actor, and a fictional news program that is recognizable as a parody of several real news programs of the era. But the broader satire is not really about any specific celebrity or media figure. It is about the structure of celebrity scandal itself, about how the industry of public attention works, about how a story that is essentially untrue can achieve the social and emotional weight of fact simply through the process of being told repeatedly and convincingly. What is remarkable about Homer Badman, watching it from the present, is how accurately it anticipated the dynamics of the internet age in the context of television age media. The mechanisms are different, the scale is different, the speed is different, but the underlying logic, the way a narrative takes hold, the way it becomes self-sustaining, the way the subject of the narrative loses control over their own story, is exactly the same. The episode was made before social media existed, but it understood social media's fundamental operating principle, that the story the culture wants to tell about you will override the story that is actually true about you, and that the only way to resist this is to have a platform large enough to make the alternative story audible. Homer does not have that platform. He is a man with a middling job at a nuclear power plant and a family that believes him and neighbors who mostly do not. He is, in this episode, a genuinely sympathetic figure caught in a system designed to grind sympathetic figures into content. And the show, which is usually gentle with Homer in the specific sense of allowing his goodness to survive his stupidity, is not entirely gentle here. It lets the machinery run over him and does not immediately rescue him from it, because the point of the episode is precisely that the machinery cannot be stopped by the goodness of the person it is running over. This is relevant to our celebrity story because what Homer Badman is describing is the exact process that The Simpsons itself participates in. The show does not grind celebrities the way the tabloid media in Homer Badman grinds Homer, but it does compress them. It does simplify them. It does take complex human beings and find the most essential, public-facing version of them and put that version in Springfield for people to laugh at. The show understands this about itself. It has always understood it. And the tension between that understanding and the actual practice of doing it, of making celebrities into jokes, of finding the thread that unravels the sweater, is present in episodes like Homer Badman and Krusty Gets Cancelled as a kind of guilty self-awareness. Springfield knows what it does to famous people. It has been doing it for 36 years. And the fact that it keeps doing it, keeps inviting them in, keeps finding the essential joke, is not evidence of cruelty. It is evidence of the specific honesty that the show has always practiced. The honesty that says famous people and people are funny, and the machinery that turns people into famous people is also funny. And none of that machinery or fame or reputation is too sacred to look at, directly and laugh at, gently, with understanding, but without flinching. Let us now turn to the story that sits at the center of everything that is true and sad about The Simpsons and celebrity. Let us talk about the man who lived in Springfield longer than anyone else, who gave the show two of its most beloved characters, who was woven into its fabric so completely that his absence created a hole the show has never fully filled. Let us talk about Phil Hartman. Section 5. Phil Hartman and the Ghost of Springfield. There is a version of The Simpsons that does not exist, that was never made, and that would have been remarkable. It is the version where Phil Hartman stayed, where the arc of his life continued past May of 1998, where Troy McClure and Lionel Hutz kept aging alongside the show, kept getting funnier and stranger and more deeply embedded in the mythology of Springfield, kept giving Hartman a canvas on which to do the work that he was, by any reasonable measure, better at than almost anyone who has ever done it. That version does not exist. And understanding why it does not exist, and what we lost when it didn't, requires spending some time with who Phil Hartman was, and what he built inside Springfield over the course of his years with the show. Phil Hartman joined The Simpsons as a recurring voice actor in the early seasons, and became one of the most important contributors to the show's character, not in the headline sense, not in the sense of Homer or Bart or Lisa, but in the texture sense. In the way that a show's world is made rich, not just by its central characters, but by the accumulated detail of the people surrounding them, the voices that populate the background, the recurring figures who appear and reappear, and each time they reappear carry with them the specific weight of everything they have been before. He voiced Troy McClure. He voiced Lionel Hutz. He voiced a handful of other characters who appeared less frequently, but were no less precisely rendered. Troy McClure is introduced in the second season in a brief appearance, and immediately establishes himself as something close to a perfect comedic creation. He is a former film and television actor whose career has clearly peaked and is now in a gentle, extended decline. He introduces himself with a formula that never varies. "Hi, I'm Troy McClure. You may remember me from such films and television programs as..." And then he lists 2 or 3 titles that are themselves jokes, films and shows with names that suggest careers made in the specific zones of entertainment that exist just below quality. Educational videos, regional commercials, films with earnest titles and presumably modest production values. The kind of work that a person with genuine talent and genuine ambition might find themselves doing after the larger career they expected did not quite materialize. Troy is never presented as tragic. This is essential to how the character works. He does not appear with a cloud over him. He does not invite pity. He carries himself with the full conviction of a man who has made peace with exactly where he is, who has found a way to inhabit his diminished professional circumstances with something that looks, from certain angles, remarkably like dignity. He is cheerful. He is professional. He delivers his pitches and his educational narrations and his television appearances with commitment and energy, as though the work still matters, as though the audience is still there. The joke, the deep joke underneath all of Troy's appearances, is that the work does not matter and the audience is not quite there. But Troy does not know this, or has decided to proceed as though he does not know it, which is a form of wisdom that looks like delusion from the outside and only reveals itself as wisdom in the long view. There is a particularly beautiful episode built around Troy McClure, the 22 short films about Springfield, which aired in the 7th season and is essentially a collection of vignettes about Springfield's minor characters. One of these vignettes is built entirely around Troy, and it shows him in a moment of unexpected vulnerability, a moment where the carefully maintained cheerfulness gives way briefly to something more tired and more real. Hartman delivers this moment with exquisite precision. He knows exactly how much of the character to reveal and exactly how quickly to put the armor back on. The warmth and the sadness are present at the same time, and then they are gone. And Troy McClure continues being Troy McClure. Lionel Hutz is a different kind of creation. Where Troy is benign and slightly melancholy, Hutz is a figure of almost pure comic energy, a lawyer whose incompetence is so thoroughgoing and so enthusiastic that it becomes a kind of art form. He advertises his services with the desperation of a man who knows his clients have no better options. He makes promises he cannot possibly keep. He loses cases that should be unlosable. He operates in the specific zone of the legal system where the people who cannot afford real legal representation are forced to accept whatever they can get. And what they get is Lionel Hutz, who shows up with the energy of a man who believes in himself completely and the results of a man who has no business believing in himself at all. The character is a satire of ambulance-chasing lawyers and of the inadequacy of legal representation for people without resources. But it carries none of the bitterness that a more directly political show might bring to that subject. Hutz is not presented as a villain. He is not presented as a deliberate exploiter of the vulnerable. He is presented as a man doing his genuine best in a profession he is genuinely unsuited for. And the gap between his enthusiasm and his competence is where the comedy lives. Hartman's contribution to both characters goes beyond the voice, though the voice is remarkable in itself. His voice for Troy McClure has a particular quality, a smoothness and a practiced charm. The voice of a man who has been performing his own likability for so long that the performance has become indistinguishable from the thing itself. His voice for Hutz is more ragged, more urgent, with an underlying note of mild panic that is always visible just below the surface confidence. These are not simply voices. They are performances. They are fully inhabited characters delivered through the specific and remarkable instrument of Hartman's voice. He understood comedy with the structural precision of an engineer. He understood what made a joke work, not just in the delivery, not just in the timing, though his timing was flawless, but in the underlying architecture, in the relationship between the character and the situation, and the specific word choices that turned a line into something memorable. He was, by universal consensus among the people who worked with him, one of the most generous comedic performers of his generation. He made his scene partners funnier. He found the contribution he could make to a given piece of comedy and made it fully, without trying to claim more than his share. Phil Hartman died on May 28, 1998. He was shot by his wife, Bryn Hartman, who subsequently died by suicide. He was 49 years old. The Simpsons responded to his death in the only way that was available to them, which was to stop. They simply stopped using Troy McClure and Lionel Hutz. The characters were not killed off within the show. They were not written out. They were not replaced by other actors with different voices. They simply ceased to appear. Springfield had always been a place where people do not leave and do not age and do not die. And so the absence of Troy McClure from Springfield does not need to be explained within the logic of the show's world. He is just not there. He is just somewhere else, appearing in some other film or television program that you may or may not remember him from. The decision not to recast was made out of respect, and it was the right decision, and it created a permanent absence in the show that is felt every time a situation arises where Troy McClure or Lionel Hutz would naturally appear and does not. This is a different kind of destruction than anything else we have discussed. Springfield did not destroy Phil Hartman. The show treated him with nothing but respect and affection throughout the years he was part of it, and he treated the show with nothing but care and commitment. The destruction, if that is the right word, went in a different direction and came from a different source. It is simply that the show goes on, and Phil Hartman does not, and Springfield, which does not age, which does not change, which does not allow time to pass within its borders, preserves a version of what Phil Hartman built in the form of episodes that will always exist, performances that will always be accessible, a specific quality of comedic craftsmanship that can still be studied and admired and laughed at exactly as it was intended to be. There is a kind of immortality in this that Phil Hartman did not ask for and perhaps would have found slightly embarrassing. Troy McClure will always be on his way to some minor promotional engagement. Lionel Hutz will always be losing some case that he should be winning. They are frozen in Springfield's eternal present, exactly as they were when Hartman voiced them, unchanged and unchangeable. In 1998, the season 10 episode, Bart the Mother, is the first episode of a season that was going to be a Troy McClure season, a season in which the character was going to be given significantly more screen time and more complex storylines. The plans were in place, the writing had begun, and then everything changed. Instead, the episode that opens season 10 opens without Troy. It opens with a different energy, a slightly more subdued energy than the show usually projects at the start of a new season. The show continues. It always continues. Springfield is very good at continuing, but the shape of what it would have been, the specific and remarkable thing that Phil Hartman was building inside this show over the course of those years, that shape is gone. This is what The Simpsons and celebrity really means when it is at its most serious. Not just what happens to the famous people who pass through Springfield, but what happens to Springfield when the people who helped build it are no longer there to continue the work. The show accumulates its losses, quietly, in the form of absences that are never explained and never quite filled, and in the form of characters who simply stop appearing, because the people who made them real are simply not there anymore. Phil Hartman is Springfield's deepest grief. Not because the show will ever say so, not because it will ever acknowledge the shape of what it lost when he died, but because the absence is present in every episode that has aired since 1998. In every moment where the particular kind of warmth and precision that he brought to the show is missing. In every courtroom scene that does not have Lionel Hutz, and every civic event that does not have Troy McClure. The ghost in Springfield is not Homer dreaming in his coma. The ghost in Springfield is a cheerful, handsome, impossible man who is always just about to introduce himself as someone you may remember from such films and television programs as. Let that sit for a moment. Let us breathe for a moment in the quiet. And then let us move forward, because the story continues and the show continues. And there are other celebrities to account for and other encounters to examine. Let us talk about the women. Section 6. The women who came to Springfield. There is a pattern in The Simpsons' treatment of female celebrity guests that is worth examining carefully, and without the kind of comfortable conclusion that would make it easy to dismiss. The show has, over the course of its run, invited hundreds of famous women into Springfield. It has done so with varying degrees of care, varying levels of insight, and varying outcomes for both the celebrities and the show itself. Some of these appearances are among the best things the show has ever done. Some of them are among the most uncomfortable, not because the show is deliberately cruel, but because the show, like everything produced by the culture that made it, reflects the specific and sometimes troubling assumptions of that culture about what famous women are for and what makes them interesting. This is not a simple story. The show does not have a single, consistent approach to famous women. Its treatment of female celebrities has evolved over 36 years, has improved in some respects and remained complicated in others, and has produced moments of genuine brilliance alongside moments that have aged less gracefully. We will try to tell it honestly. Let us begin with Elizabeth Taylor, because Elizabeth Taylor is in some ways the ideal starting point for a conversation about how The Simpsons handles female celebrity. Taylor appeared in the show in the third season in the episode A Streetcar Named Marge, which aired in September of 1992. And what she did there was something so small and so perfectly executed that it has become one of the most discussed moments in the show's entire run. She voiced Maggie Simpson's first word. The word was daddy. It was spoken at the end of the episode, quietly, simply, without any of the grand theatrical weight that one might expect from Elizabeth Taylor delivering even a single word. It was just a baby saying her first word. Just the sound of a word that means everything to the person who hears it. And it was Elizabeth Taylor's voice, unmistakably carrying within it all the history and texture and specific quality of a woman who had been speaking on screen since she was a child, and who understood, better than almost anyone alive, how much a single word can hold. The casting is a joke, obviously. It is funny that they got Elizabeth Taylor to say one word. It is funny that the one word she says is daddy, which is a word that carries a particular resonance given the arc of Taylor's own life and romantic history. It is funny that this enormous cultural institution, this woman who had been one of the most famous people on earth for the better part of 4 decades, showed up to say a single word and then left. But underneath the joke, there is something real. Elizabeth Taylor in 1992 was in the later stages of a career and a life that had been defined by extremes, by the kind of fame that generates both adoration and cruelty in equal measure, by the specific experience of being a woman whose value to the culture has been tied, from the beginning, to her appearance and her romantic relationships and the spectacular and often tragic drama of her personal life. She had been, at various points, the most discussed woman on earth, discussed for reasons that had almost nothing to do with her work, and almost everything to do with who she was sleeping with, and whether she was fat, and whether she was dying, and whether she was happy. Coming to Springfield to say one word, to step outside all of that, to strip away everything except the single syllable of a baby's first speech, was a kind of gift that the show gave to Taylor as much as Taylor gave to the show. For one brief moment, Elizabeth Taylor was just a voice. Not a face, not a body, not a marriage, not a scandal, just a voice saying a word that means love. The show has done this with female celebrities more generally, used the medium of animation to strip away the visual component of their fame, the specific burden that comes with being famous, partly because of how you look, and focus on what they sound like and what they say and what they can do with language and performance. Meryl Streep appeared in the show in the 9th season, in the episode Realty Bites, though her most remembered connection to the show is through a different appearance. Kathleen Turner voiced various characters across several episodes, and brought to the show's world a particular quality of world-weary wit that suited Springfield's sensibility. Helen Hunt appeared. Susan Sarandon, Tyne Daly, Marcia Wallace, who voiced Bart's teacher, Mrs. Crabapple, for the show's entire run until her death in 2013. A regular cast member rather than a celebrity guest, but someone whose presence in the show's universe was profound, and whose absence, when it came, created a permanent silence in Springfield's school hallways. Marcia Wallace was in the show from the beginning. She was one of the original voices. And Mrs. Crabapple, the character she inhabited, was one of the show's most complex and most humanly rendered female characters. She was not defined by her appearance or her relationships in the reductive way that female characters in animated shows often are. She was defined by her wit, her exhaustion, her grudging affection for the children she teaches, her specific kind of middle-aged disappointment that has curdled not into bitterness but into a wry acceptance of exactly what her life is and is not. When Marcia Wallace died of pneumonia in October of 2013, the show again did what it had done with Phil Hartman. It simply stopped. Mrs. Crabapple did not die in Springfield. She was not replaced by another actor. She retired, off-screen, to somewhere unspecified. The show allowed her to leave the frame without ceremony, and in doing so acknowledged that the character and the voice were the same thing, that one could not exist without the other. The episode that aired shortly after Wallace's death, 4 Regrettings and a Funeral, included a dedication to her that was brief and direct. Not a tribute episode. Not a special. Just a card at the end, acknowledging that she had been there and was now not, and that her absence was real and permanent and felt. This is the gentler side of Springfield's relationship with the people who inhabit it. The show can be ruthless with celebrity. It can take famous people apart and find the joke in every piece. But it treats the people who actually live in Springfield, who built their careers inside the show's world, with a different kind of care. It treats their deaths as deaths. It does not replace them. It leaves the space they occupied unfilled, as a form of acknowledgement. Let us move from this gentler register back toward the more complicated territory of celebrity appearances. Let us talk about Cher. Cher's relationship with The Simpsons is interesting because Cher has, throughout her career, demonstrated a remarkable facility for self-parody that makes her an ideal Springfield guest. She has never been a celebrity who takes her own mythology entirely seriously, or rather, she has always been a celebrity who takes her work seriously while treating the mythology as raw material for comedy, as something that can be played with and exaggerated and turned into something deliberately absurd. She appeared in the show's later seasons, and her appearance, while entertaining, is less interesting than the broader observation that she represents a particular type of celebrity that Springfield handles very well. The icon who is fully in on the joke. Cher, Madonna, Dolly Parton, figures who have spent enough time at the center of cultural attention to understand that the mythology around them is a construction, that they built it, that they own it, and that the most powerful thing they can do with it is choose to laugh at it themselves. Springfield is most comfortable with famous people who understand this, who come in with their defenses down, who offer the essential joke of themselves freely rather than forcing the writers to find it. The guests who thrive in Springfield are the ones who have already done the work of reducing themselves to their most essential public form and are ready to inhabit that form with humor. The female celebrity appearances that have generated the most controversy, the most uncomfortable critical discussion, are almost always the ones where the show does not manage to transcend the cultural assumptions about famous women that it inherited from the broader entertainment context of its time. There are episodes, particularly in the middle seasons, where female celebrity guests are reduced in ways that are less about finding the essential comedic truth of a person and more about reinforcing a specific and limiting set of ideas about what female fame is supposed to look like. This is not a simple indictment. The show is a product of its culture, as all shows are. It was made by a writing staff that was, particularly in its earlier seasons, predominantly male, and the assumptions of that demographic are visible in the work in ways that are sometimes charming and sometimes not. The show has gotten better at this over time. Its treatment of female characters and female celebrity guests has become more nuanced and more thoughtful as the writing staff has diversified and as the cultural conversation about representation has evolved. But the history is there, and it is worth acknowledging that some of the women who came to Springfield were handled with less care than the men, that the joke was sometimes at their expense in a way that it was not quite at the expense of their male counterparts, that the essential reduction of female fame sometimes landed on things that were unkind rather than simply honest. Ellen DeGeneres appeared in the show in the 9th season and was handled with genuine warmth and respect. Her appearance, which coincided with the period when she was publicly coming out as gay, is interesting in the specific context of 1997, when that disclosure was still culturally significant and still capable of generating controversy. The show's treatment of her sexuality is casual and matter-of-fact, which was itself a political position in 1997. The position that this was not a remarkable thing, that it was simply a fact about a person, and that it was a person's business, and that the comedy was somewhere else entirely and not in the sexuality. Dolly Parton's appearance in an episode in the later seasons is essentially a masterclass in the kind of celebrity self-deprecation that Springfield rewards. Parton has always been extraordinary at making the joke of her own mythology available to other people, at finding the comedy in the Dolly Parton persona while making clear that the persona is only one part of what she is. She arrives in Springfield already Springfield ready, already reduced to her essential comic form, which is also a form of greatness, an acknowledgement that the things the culture has fixated on about her, the hair, the measurements, the rhinestone excess, are real things that she chose and built and owns completely. Parton's appearance is warm and funny and leaves her reputation entirely intact, which is the ideal Springfield outcome for any celebrity. You come in, you do the episode, you allow yourself to be the joke for a half hour, and you leave still being the full and complicated person you were when you arrived. You have sacrificed nothing except the pretense that you are above being laughed at, and you have gained something in return. The specific kind of goodwill that comes from being willing to be funny about yourself. Let us now discuss an appearance that did not go this smoothly. Let us talk about Kim Basinger. Kim Basinger appeared in the show in the 8th season, in the episode A Millhouse Divided, which aired in November of 1996. Her appearance was brief and largely functional. A celebrity cameo in the traditional sense. A famous person dropping into Springfield for a moment and dropping out again. The reason Basinger's appearance is worth discussing is not the appearance itself, but what the cultural context around it reveals about the show's relationship with female celebrity in the mid-1990s. Basinger was in 1996 one of the most famous actresses in Hollywood, known for a combination of critically respected work and highly publicized personal life. She had been in 9.5 Weeks in L.A. Confidential and a number of other films, and she had also been involved in a series of high-profile personal and professional controversies that had generated significant tabloid coverage. The show was not interested in any of this. The show simply placed her briefly in Springfield and moved on. But the specific way in which she was placed, the kind of role she was given, reflects something about how the show understood female celebrity in 1996 that is worth sitting with. She was there to be a celebrity, to be a famous person in Springfield, which is a different thing from being a person whose specific fame is examined or complicated or used as the basis for actual comedy. This pattern, the pattern of female celebrities being used as markers of fame rather than as subjects of comedy, appears more frequently in the show's middle years than it does in either its earliest or its most recent seasons. It is a limitation of the show's ambition with respect to female guests, a place where the show's otherwise impressive intelligence about celebrity simply does not apply with full force. Let us move from individual appearances to a figure who represents something broader about Springfield's relationship with a certain kind of female cultural authority. Let us talk about Oprah Winfrey, who has never actually appeared in The Simpsons, but whose absence is as interesting as any appearance. Oprah Winfrey, in the 1990s and 2000s, was arguably the most culturally powerful woman in America. Her reach, her influence, her specific form of celebrity, which was built around a kind of intimate public sincerity, around the cultivation of trust on a massive scale, was unlike anything that had existed in American media before. She was not simply famous. She was woven into the daily emotional life of millions of people in a way that political figures and entertainers generally were not. The Simpsons has never had Oprah Winfrey appear in the show. This is notable because almost every other cultural institution of comparable magnitude has had some contact with Springfield. But Oprah has not. And the reason, according to various accounts, is that the terms of her participation were never right, that what the show wanted to do with her and what she was willing to have done were not in alignment. This is not surprising. Oprah's specific form of celebrity is arguably the one that is most difficult to reduce. What is the joke about Oprah? There are jokes about specific things, about the giveaway culture of her show, about the specific emotional register of her public persona, about the way she occupies the cultural space between entertainment and therapy. But these jokes, when attempted, have a tendency to feel unkind, in a way that jokes about other kinds of celebrity do not. Because Oprah's celebrity is built on the claim that it is not a performance, that the sincerity is real, that the intimacy is genuine, making that the punchline requires calling her sincerity a lie, and the show, which is gently honest about people rather than cruel about them, does not quite know how to do that. The absence of Oprah from Springfield is a small piece of evidence about the limits of what Springfield can do and what Springfield wants to do. There are some kinds of fame that resist the show's particular form of satire. Not because they are beyond reproach, but because the mechanism of reduction that the show relies on does not have a clean entry point. Let us leave the women now and move toward a different kind of celebrity encounter. Let us move into the space where Springfield and political power intersect, where the show has been most consistently pointed in its observations and most consistently uncomfortable for the people it depicts. Let us talk about the presidents. Section 7, Presidents, Politicians, and the Permanent Record. The Simpsons has been on the air through 8 American presidencies: Reagan, Bush the First, Clinton, Bush the Second, Obama, Trump, Biden, and whatever comes after. It has watched American politics transform from something that was broadly legible, if always imperfect and always somewhat absurd, into something that looks, from certain angles, exactly like Springfield. Into something where the gap between satire and reality has narrowed to the point where the satirist and the subject are sometimes indistinguishable. The show's relationship with political celebrity is its own long story, and it is a story worth telling carefully because it illustrates something important about what satire can and cannot do, about what happens when the thing you are satirizing catches up to and then surpasses the satire itself. Let us begin with George H.W. Bush, George H.W. Bush appeared in The Simpsons not in the show itself, but in a television commercial that the show made for the 1992 Super Bowl, in which he stated that he wanted American families to be more like the Waltons and less like The Simpsons. This statement was made in the context of the presidential campaign and was a direct reference to the show, which by 1992 had become a significant enough cultural presence to merit explicit mention in the rhetoric of a sitting president. The show responded immediately and directly. They wrote and produced a brief segment in which Homer addresses the camera and points out that the Simpsons are actually a lot like the Waltons, in the specific sense that both families are praying for the end of the Depression. It is a near-perfect piece of political comedy, compact and precise, using a single observation to make a point about the gap between political rhetoric and economic reality that is more honest and more effective than most explicitly political commentary manages to be. Bush's willingness to pick a public fight with a cartoon family says something interesting about the cultural moment. By 1992, The Simpsons had become significant enough that a president felt it necessary to define himself against it, to draw a contrast between his values and the values that the show appeared to represent. This was a kind of acknowledgement that the show mattered, that it was shaping the cultural conversation in ways that had real-world implications, that it was not merely entertainment but something closer to a competing vision of American family life. The show took this seriously. It has always taken political commentary seriously, more seriously perhaps than it takes almost any other kind of comedy. The satirical observations about political power that run through the show's 36-year run are some of its most durable and most honest work. George H.W. Bush's actual relationship with The Simpsons extended beyond the commercial exchange. The show has referenced him and depicted him in various contexts over the years, always with the specific flavor of comedy that the show reserves for authority figures it genuinely likes, while also finding genuinely funny. Bush was not the show's villain. Burns is the show's villain. Bush was the kind of figure the show could be affectionate about while also being accurate about his limitations. The Bush who moved into 1407 Evergreen Terrace across from The Simpsons, however, was the successor. George H.W. Bush and his wife Barbara appeared in the show in the 14th season in the episode Mr. Spritz Goes to Washington, in a sequence where they are shown as Homer's neighbors. The interaction is brief and gentle and suggests that the show, whatever it thinks about the political positions a person holds, is capable of separating the political from the personal when it serves the comedy. Bill Clinton's relationship with The Simpsons is longer and more complicated. Clinton appeared in several episodes and was generally depicted with a kind of exasperated affection, as a figure of genuine intelligence and charm, who was also genuinely incapable of resisting the things he should not do. The Clinton episodes are interesting because they were made during the period when the specific details of Clinton's personal life were the subject of intensive public scrutiny, and the show had to navigate the question of how much of that scrutiny to incorporate and how. What the show chose, generally, was to focus on Clinton's political persona rather than his personal behavior, which was a decision that made the comedy cleaner and more durable. The jokes about Clinton's particular relationship with truth, his specific form of political flexibility, his remarkable ability to make you feel, in his presence, that he understood you personally and completely, these jokes hold up because they are about things that are real and permanent features of who Clinton is as a political figure, rather than about specific events that are time-bound and context-dependent. The George W. Bush episodes occupy a different register. Bush arrived in the White House in January of 2001, And the show's treatment of him over the 8 years of his presidency is a document of how American satirical culture processed the Bush era in real time. The show was not always gentle with Bush. It was not trying to be. The political decisions made during his presidency were significant enough and consequential enough that the show's usual affectionate mockery gave way, at times, to something with more edge. But what is interesting about the show's treatment of Bush is that, even at its most pointed, it maintained the fundamental humanity of the target. Bush was never made into a monster in the show's world. He was made into a limited man making consequential decisions from behind the specific cognitive and emotional constraints of being that particular limited man. This is actually a more devastating form of satire than pure demonization, because it leaves nowhere to hide. It says that the problem is not evil, but inadequacy, not malice, but the specific gap between the demands of the moment and the capacity of the person facing it. Barack Obama's appearance in The Simpsons came in the show's 24th season, and it is worth discussing in some detail because it represents a very specific kind of celebrity encounter. One where the show is meeting not just a political figure, but a cultural symbol. A figure whose significance is tied up with ideas and aspirations that are larger than the person themselves. Obama, by the time of his appearance, had become something that very few political figures ever become, which is genuinely mythological. He carried a weight of hope and expectation and symbolic significance that went far beyond anything a normal political figure could support. And the show, which is always honest about the gap between what things mean and what things are, had to navigate that weight carefully. The show's treatment of Obama and his appearance is notably warm, but not hagiographic. It finds the comedy in the specific experience of being someone on whom so many people have projected so much, of being the vessel for aspirations that no single person could possibly fulfill. It treats Obama as a human being, which by the time of his appearance was itself a gentle political act, given the intensity of the dehumanizing rhetoric that had surrounded his presidency. And Donald Trump. We cannot talk about The Simpsons and political celebrity without talking about Donald Trump, because The Simpsons and Donald Trump are linked in the cultural imagination in a way that neither the show nor Trump himself could have anticipated, a way that has become central to any discussion of the show's cultural significance. The story begins in the year 2000. The episode is Bart to the Future, and it aired in March of that year. In a flash-forward sequence, the show depicts a future in which Lisa Simpson has become the first female president of the United States. She is taking office after an unnamed predecessor who is referred to as President Trump and who has, in the show's version of events, left the American economy in ruins. President Trump is mentioned once, briefly, as an explanation for the fiscal disaster that Lisa is inheriting. The episode aired 16 years before Trump was elected president. The cultural response to this, when the connection was made after the 2016 election, was enormous. Screenshots from the episode went viral. The Simpsons predicted Trump became a phrase used by people who had not watched the show in years, by people who had never watched the show at all. It became a meme, a shorthand, a piece of evidence, and a particular kind of argument about the nature of reality and the peculiar wisdom of this cartoon. The writer who wrote that episode, Dan Greeny, was asked about it after the election and gave an answer that has been widely quoted. He said that the Trump presidency was intended as a warning, that the joke was meant to be a dystopian vision of the future, not a prediction but a caution, and then he said something that is worth sitting with. That in the show's universe, the joke was that the most absurd possible outcome had occurred, and that the real-world outcome had vindicated the absurdity. Trump himself had been a figure in New York media culture and in the broader American celebrity landscape for decades before his political career began. He had appeared on various television programs. He had been a presence in the tabloids. He had, at various points in the 1980s and 1990s, discussed a possible presidential run without following through on it. He was a known quantity, a certain kind of larger-than-life New York businessman whose specific form of self-promotion had made him famous in the specific way that people are famous for being famous, rather than for doing something that merits fame. The show's observation in the year 2000 that a Trump presidency would be a symptom of something wrong rather than an achievement to be celebrated was not prophetic. It was analytical. It was looking at what Trump represented in the cultural imagination, what his specific kind of celebrity signified, and drawing the logical conclusion about what a world that had elected him to the highest office would look like and mean. The show continued to engage with Trump throughout his political career and his presidency. It was not always comfortable. The show that had spent years treating political figures with affectionate mockery found that with Trump, the scale of the subject made affection difficult to sustain alongside accuracy. The specific things that made Trump a target for satire were also the specific things that made satire feel inadequate as a response to what was actually happening. This is a problem that all satire faces eventually, when the thing being satirized becomes serious enough that laughter feels insufficient. The Simpsons did not solve this problem. It navigated it imperfectly, as all satire does in the face of something that resists satirical reduction. The show that is best at finding the human comedy inside any public figure found itself facing a figure whose public persona was so thoroughly a construction, so entirely a performance, that the mechanism of satirical reduction had nothing to grip. What do you do with a figure who is already a caricature? What do you do in Springfield with someone who has already reduced themselves to their most cartoonish form? You can exaggerate the exaggeration, push it further, make the caricature of the caricature. But at a certain point, you are no longer satirizing. You are simply duplicating. And duplication is not comedy. The Simpsons' Trump problem is a version of the broader problem that all political satire faced in this period. And the show's imperfect solutions to it are worth acknowledging honestly. It did not always find the right register. It was not always sure how seriously to take something that simultaneously invited ridicule and resisted it. But it kept trying, which is what the show does. It always keeps trying. Let us leave the White House and move somewhere louder and faster and more brightly lit. Let us talk about the athletes. Section 8, Jockstraps and Glory and Springfield Sports Stars. Sports and The Simpsons have a long and remarkably rich relationship, one that reveals something interesting about the difference between athletic celebrity and entertainment celebrity, between the fame that comes from doing something that ordinary people can assess directly and the fame that comes from the more mediated world of acting or music or politics. Athletic celebrity has a specific quality that makes it both easier and harder to satirize. Easier because athletic performance, unlike acting or music, is evaluated against a clear and objective standard. Either you can run a 4.440 or you cannot. Either you can hit a 95-mile-an-hour fastball or you cannot. The gap between what athletes can do and what the rest of us can do is so enormous and so measurable that it creates a natural comedy of proportion, a natural source of jokes about the absurd specificity of talent, about the fact that a person can be so extraordinarily good at one very narrow thing while remaining entirely ordinary at everything else. Harder because athletic celebrity tends to be built around physical achievement, and physical achievement, once it has been demonstrated, is difficult to take away. You can mock an athlete's personality, you can find the comedy in their public behavior, but the record stands. The championship exists. The trophy is in a case somewhere. And that residual reality, the permanent fact of what the person actually did on the field or the court or the track, provides a kind of bedrock that is resistant to satirical erosion. The Simpsons has navigated this tension with considerable skill over the years, and its sports celebrity episodes include some of the most precise and affectionate observations the show has ever made about the nature of fame and achievement. Let us begin with perhaps the most significant sports celebrity appearance in the show's history. Not in terms of the celebrity's fame, but in terms of what the episode accomplished. Homer at the Bat, which aired in the third season in February of 1992, is one of the show's most celebrated episodes, and it is built almost entirely around the participation of actual Major League Baseball players. The premise involves Mr. Burns, who enters the Springfield nuclear power plant softball team in a high-stakes competition. Wanting to ensure victory, Burns hires 9 professional baseball players to join the team in place of the regular employees. The players recruited for the episode are Wade Boggs, Ken Griffey Jr., Don Mattingly, Roger Clemens, Ozzie Smith, Jose Canseco, Darryl Strawberry, Steve Sachs, and Mike Scioscia. These are not minor figures from the margins of the baseball world. These are, collectively, some of the most accomplished and celebrated baseball players of the late 1980s and early 1990s. Several of them are Hall of Famers, and the episode assigns to each of them a specific comedic fate that is a precisely calibrated joke about their public image. Roger Clemens is hypnotized into believing he is a chicken. Wade Boggs is knocked unconscious in a dispute about the greatest British Prime Minister. Ozzie Smith falls into a dimensional vortex. Don Mattingly is benched by Mr. Burns because of what Burns believes is sideburns, but which is actually the normal shape of his hair. Mike Sciascia gets radiation poisoning. Each joke is specific to the person. Each joke finds exactly the right angle of approach. What makes Homer at the Bat remarkable is not just the quality of the individual jokes, but the willingness of the players to commit to them fully. These are men who, in their real professional lives, are surrounded by the specific protocols of athletic masculinity, by the expectation that they will maintain a particular kind of presence, serious and competitive and focused in the way that professional athletes are expected to be. And they came to a cartoon and agreed to be hypnotized chickens. They agreed to fall into dimensional vortexes. They agreed to be the punchline of jokes that were genuinely at their expense in a way that made them look ridiculous. This required a specific kind of generosity and a specific kind of self-assurance. You can only agree to look ridiculous in public if you are confident enough in your real achievements that the ridicule cannot damage them. The Hall of Famers who came to Springfield were secure enough in what they had actually done on the field to allow themselves to be made foolish in a cartoon for 30 minutes on a Tuesday night. Darryl Strawberry's inclusion in the episode is particularly interesting in retrospect. Strawberry was in 1992 one of the most talented and most troubled figures in baseball, a player of extraordinary ability whose career was shadowed by personal and substance-related difficulties that would eventually limit and ultimately define his legacy. The episode gives him a specific joke about his home run capacity, about the physical reality of what he can do, and it is affectionate and admiring rather than mocking. Watching the episode now, knowing what would happen to Strawberry's career in the years that followed, the affection in the episode feels like something preserved, a moment of pure enjoyment of what he could do captured before the complications that would follow. Springfield keeps him exactly as he was in 1992, at the peak of his considerable abilities, before the story took the turns it took. Jose Canseco's appearance is also interesting in retrospect, for different reasons. Canseco, who in 1992 was known primarily as one of the most physically impressive baseball players of his generation, would later become famous for a different kind of disclosure, for the memoir in which he alleged widespread steroid use in professional baseball. His Springfield appearance predates all of this, and is built around his reputation as a physically remarkable athlete, as someone whose combination of size and speed and power seemed almost superhuman. The Superman quality, the almost too good to be entirely natural quality of Canseco's athletic performance, is present in the episode as a source of comedy, but not of suspicion. In 1992, the performance was simply the performance. The explanation for it, the specific and complicated story of how it was produced, had not yet become public knowledge. This is another way in which Springfield functions as a time capsule. It preserves the public image that existed at the time of the episode's making, without foreknowledge of what would come later. Canseco in Springfield is a Superman. The subsequent story is not there. Let us talk now about Michael Jordan's absence from The Simpsons, because in the context of a conversation about sports celebrities in the show, Jordan's absence is as significant as any presence. Michael Jordan, by the early 1990s, was already the most famous athlete on the planet. His combination of athletic achievement, cultural presence, and commercial appeal had made him something beyond the category of sports celebrity. He was simply famous, in the way that few people in any field ever achieve. Famous in every country. Famous to people who had no interest in basketball. Famous in the specific way that happens when an individual becomes a symbol for something larger than their sport or their work. Jordan never appeared on The Simpsons. This is partly a matter of scheduling and preference. Partly a matter of the specific calculations that someone of Jordan's stature makes about how to deploy their cultural presence. But it is also, perhaps, a matter of what The Simpsons would have done with him. Jordan's particular form of fame is notably resistant to the kind of reduction that the show practices. What is the joke about Michael Jordan? There are jokes about his competitive intensity, about the specific and frightening depth of his need to win, about the way this need has made him a formidable and sometimes difficult human being. But these jokes require acknowledging that underneath them is something so extraordinary that the jokes feel thin by comparison. The show that reduced Homer to his essential form and found the comedy there, that reduced rock stars and presidents and actors to their most compressed public selves, does not quite have a mechanism for Jordan. Because Jordan's essential public self is so genuinely overwhelming that comedy cannot get purchase on it. Bo Jackson is a different story. Bo Jackson appeared in the show in the later seasons, and his appearance is built around the specific mythology of his multi-sport career, around the fact that he was the only person of his generation who was simultaneously a legitimate professional star in both football and baseball, a fact so statistically improbable that it generated its own mythology. Bo knows, the Nike commercial slogan that became a cultural shorthand for a certain kind of transcendent athletic versatility. The show uses this mythology gently, acknowledging that it exists and that it is inherently funny, that the idea of one person being demonstrably better at two very different sports than almost every person who has ever played either of those sports is both true and inherently absurd. The kind of truth that sounds like boasting even when it is simply accurate. Soccer provides a different set of celebrity encounters, particularly in the show's later seasons when the show began reflecting the increasingly global nature of its audience. Pelé appeared, bringing with him the specific quality of a man who exists in a category so far above the normal scale of athletic achievement that the word great does not quite fit, the way a word like big does not quite fit the Pacific Ocean. The show's handling of Pelé is interesting because it struggles slightly with the same problem it has with Jordan. The figure is too large for the mechanism of reduction to work cleanly. You can find the comedy in the gap between the mythology and the man, in the specific human awkwardness that persists even in figures of genuinely extraordinary achievement. But the mythology resists being the punchline. Dennis Rodman's appearance is a different matter entirely. Rodman, who by the mid-1990s had established himself as a figure of spectacular theatrical self-invention, as a man who understood that the persona was the product and who had pushed that understanding to its most extreme possible expression, is essentially Springfield ready in a way that very few celebrities have ever been. He has already done the work of reducing himself to his most essential public form. He has already stripped away every conventional expectation about what a professional athlete should look and behave like and replaced it with something so aggressively individual that it can only be described as art. The Springfield version of Rodman is not significantly different from the real version, which is the highest compliment that the show can pay to a celebrity. You cannot make Rodman more cartoonish than Rodman made himself. You can only borrow his cartoonishness, inhabit it briefly, and hand it back. Mike Tyson, who appeared in a later episode under a thinly veiled pseudonym, represents a different kind of athletic celebrity story, one where the mythology has layers of darkness and tragedy underneath the sporting achievement that makes straightforward comedy difficult. Tyson's career trajectory, from youngest heavyweight champion in history to the complicated and painful middle passages of his life, contains the kind of real human suffering that the show has to handle carefully to avoid being cruel. The show handles it by focusing on the specific and somewhat surreal quality of Tyson's public persona in his later years, on the way he had become something stranger and more interesting than a simple villain, on the specific comedic quality of his voice and his manner, and the gap between his fearsome physical reputation and the sometimes gentle, sometimes vulnerable person who has appeared in the later stages of his public life. The show is not cruel to Tyson. It finds the comedy that is genuine rather than the comedy that would require making light of things that are genuinely painful. The Magic Johnson and Larry Bird era of basketball generates a different kind of celebrity interaction with the show. Both men appeared in the Springfield universe in various forms, and the show's handling of their rivalry, which by the late 1980s had become one of the great narratives of American sports, is affectionate and precise. The rivalry itself is a gift to satirists because it is built around a contrast so clean and so legible, the flamboyant Los Angeles star versus the cerebral New England star, that it practically satirizes itself. What The Simpsons does with athletic celebrity at its best is something that the sports media itself often fails to do. It separates the achievement from the myth. It acknowledges that the achievement is real and remarkable while also acknowledging that the myth, the cultural construction that surrounds the achievement, is a separate thing, a product of the culture's need to make heroes, to find in specific human beings an expression of something universal. And it treats both things honestly, the achievement with respect, and the myth with comedy, because the comedy of myths does not diminish the achievements that generated them. Let us turn now from the jocks to the musicians who came after Aerosmith and Cypress Hill, the musicians who walked into Springfield in the mid to late 1990s and the 2000s and got a different kind of treatment, a treatment that reflected the specific cultural moments they were part of and the specific places they occupied in the cultural imagination. Let us talk about the musicians who were not entirely comfortable in Springfield, who found that the show's affection and the show's honesty were sometimes the same thing, and that this sameness was not always comfortable. Section 9. The musicians who stayed and the ones who left. The relationship between popular music and The Simpsons over the show's full run is a history of American music compressed into a series of 12-minute guest spots, of how fame in the music world is made and managed and occasionally undermined, of what happens when a show that is fundamentally committed to honesty meets an art form that is fundamentally committed to mythology. Music is different from acting and different from sports in the specific way that it makes it celebrities. Actors become famous through a character, through the gap between themselves and the person they are playing. Sports stars become famous through physical achievement, through the objective reality of what their bodies can do. But musicians become famous through something that is supposed to be the self. Music, particularly popular music, presents itself as autobiography, as confession, as the direct transmission of an interior experience into an exterior form. Whether this is true, whether the music is actually autobiographical, whether the confession is actual rather than constructed, is a separate question. The presentation is what matters. Music is sold as selfhood, and this creates a specific dynamic when the self that has been sold encounters Springfield's gentle machinery of reduction. What happens when the song is You and Springfield Makes You Funny? Let us begin with Spinal Tap, or rather with the concept that Spinal Tap crystallized. This is Spinal Tap, the 1984 mockumentary about a fictional heavy metal band, predates The Simpsons but runs on similar principles. It finds the comedy in the gap between the mythology of rock and roll, the grandeur and the excess and the cosmic ambition, and the specific human reality of slightly confused middle-aged men trying to load equipment into a van in a parking lot. The Simpsons understood this gap intuitively and returned to it throughout its run. The rock bands that Springfield handles most effectively are the ones that have built their mythology on the largest and most operatic possible scale, because the comedy of deflation is most powerful when the inflation has been most extreme. This is why the Smashing Pumpkins moment in Homerpalooza works. The bigger the claim, the funnier the small room. Billy Corgan in a Springfield backstage area eating a sandwich is funny precisely because Billy Corgan has made such enormous claims about the weight and significance of his work. Not because the claims are false, but because the claims are large enough that the contrast with the sandwich is visible. The musicians who struggled in Springfield are the ones whose mythology was built on a different kind of claim. Not the claim of cosmic significance, but the claim of authenticity. The claim that the music is real and the person is real, and the connection between them is genuine and unmediated. James Brown appeared in the later seasons of the show, and his appearance is one of the most interesting in the show's history precisely because of how it navigates the authentic claim. Brown's mythology was built on a very specific kind of physical truth, on the reality of what he could do with his voice and his body on a stage, on a kind of performance that was too visceral and too real to be easily reduced to a cartoon. And yet his persona, the specific theatrical construction of the godfather of soul, the specific language of his public self, is so elaborate and so distinctive that it invites satire. The show threads this needle by finding a way to be affectionate about the persona while being honest about its constructed quality. The Springfield version of James Brown is unmistakably Brown, carrying all the specific verbal tics and theatrical flourishes that made him a figure of cultural fascination for 60 years. But he is also clearly playing a version of himself, aware that the version is a performance, and the awareness is where the comedy lives. Mick Jagger and Keith Richards. The Stones. Let us talk about the Stones. The Rolling Stones appeared in the show in the 15th season, in an episode called How I Spent My Strummer Vacation, which aired in November of 2002. The episode involves Homer discovering that a fantasy rock and roll camp exists where ordinary people can spend a week learning to be rock stars alongside actual rock legends. Homer enrolls. The premise is perfect for what the show does, for the comedy of the gap between the mythology and the reality, between what rock and roll looks like from the outside and what it looks like from the inside. And the Rolling Stones, who are by any measure one of the most mythologized bands in the history of popular music, whose mythology includes everything from the Stones as ambassadors of a certain kind of liberated excess to the Stones as a business empire of remarkable efficiency and durability, are the ideal guests for this premise. Jagger's voice work in the episode is notably specific and notably good. He does not simply phone it in. He commits to the comedy, finds the angle on his own mythology that the episode is reaching for, and delivers it with the kind of relaxed self-awareness that comes from 40 years of understanding what you look like from the outside. Jagger has always been unusual among rock stars in the degree to which he has maintained a visible intellectual distance from the persona, an awareness that Mick Jagger is a construction, a carefully maintained piece of theater, and that this awareness does not make it less effective, but actually more so. Keith Richards is a different kind of figure. Richards's mythology is built not on self-awareness, but on the specific and apparently sincere commitment to a way of life that should, by any physiological standard, have killed him several times over. The joke about Keith Richards is that he is essentially indestructible, that whatever the human body can survive, he has survived it, that he exists as a kind of proof that the laws of biology are not as universal as we thought. The show uses this gently, allows it to be present without making it the only thing Richards is. Which is the right approach? Because Richards, underneath the mythology, is a formidable musician and a specific and interesting human being, and the show is better when it finds both things rather than simply reaching for the easy joke. Lenny Kravitz appeared in the show and brought with him a specific kind of 1990s celebrity. The celebrity of revival, of taking things that had been culturally powerful in earlier decades and making them new again. Kravitz's musical project was explicitly retrospective, drawing on the specific sounds and styles of 1960s and 1970s rock and soul, and presenting them with the production quality and cultural access of the early 1990s. The show uses him affectionately, with an awareness that the retrospective project is both genuinely skilled and inherently a little funny, because the thing about earnestly reviving the past is that the earnestness is always slightly at odds with the irony that the past deserves. Justin Timberlake's appearance in the show, in the later seasons, represents a different kind of musical celebrity. The celebrity that is built partly on the infrastructure of a specific moment, on being the right kind of attractive and the right kind of talented at the right cultural moment. Timberlake, whose career began in the context of late 90s teen pop, before he successfully repositioned himself as a solo artist of genuine sophistication, is interesting to the show primarily as a figure of transition, as someone who has managed the trick of changing what he is while maintaining the continuity of what he means. The show uses Timberlake with the specific kind of warmth that it gives to celebrities who are clearly self-aware about their own significance, who understand that the machinery of their fame is a machinery rather than simply the truth of their value. Timberlake, who has been public and articulate about the constructed quality of his persona, about the work that goes into maintaining relevance in the specific way that he has maintained it, is already doing the show's work for it. He has already reduced himself to his most self-aware form. The show has only to borrow it. Beck is one of the more interesting musical appearances in the show's history, not because of anything particularly spectacular that happened in the episode, but because of what Beck represented at the moment of his appearance. Beck arrived in the mid-1990s as something that was genuinely difficult to categorize, as a musician who was not operating within any of the established frameworks that the music industry used to sell and explain artists. He was using samples and folk guitar and hip-hop production and country imagery and psychedelic aesthetics in combinations that had no precedent. And the cultural reception to his work was characterized by a combination of genuine enthusiasm and genuine confusion. The show's handling of Beck reflects this combination. It does not quite know what to do with him, which is itself accurate to the broader cultural experience of Beck in the 1990s. It handles him warmly but slightly off-center, which is exactly the right approach to a musician who was himself slightly off-center with respect to everything. Tom Jones is worth discussing as a case study in a specific kind of musical celebrity that The Simpsons handles with particular skill. The celebrity that is built around a kind of masculine excess that the culture simultaneously celebrates and finds faintly ridiculous. Jones, whose career began in the 1960s with a voice of remarkable power and range, and whose public image was built around the specific and somewhat theatrical quality of his physicality and his effect on audiences, particularly female audiences, is a figure that invites a very particular kind of comedy. The comedy is not about whether he is talented. He clearly is. The comedy is about the gap between the grandiosity of the performance and the essential domestic smallness of the man underneath it. A gap that Jones himself has always been willing to acknowledge and even to amplify, because he has always understood that the acknowledgement does not diminish the grandeur, but rather enriches it by making it human. Springfield uses Jones in an episode that plays with this gap with the kind of precision that only comes from a writer's room that has genuinely thought about what makes a person funny, rather than simply reaching for the obvious note. Elvis Costello appeared on the show and brought with him the specific qualities of a musician who has been successful enough for long enough to carry the authority of someone who has seen everything and found it all interesting. Costello, who has moved between new wave and country and classical and jazz and chamber music and everything in between over the course of his career, and who has done so with a consistency of intelligence and purpose that makes it difficult to reduce him to any single thing, is one of the show's more challenging musical guests precisely because he resists the simplification that the show's mechanism requires. The show handles this by focusing not on his music, but on his persona, on the specific quality of a man who is perpetually slightly surprised by his own success and slightly amused by the categories that other people apply to him. This is accurate, and it is funny, and it leaves his musical legacy untouched. Let us now talk about the musicians who were treated less gently, or rather whose encounters with Springfield had consequences that were less comfortable. The story of the show and Yoko Ono is short and pointed. Ono is not a musician in the traditional sense, but exists at the intersection of art and music and celebrity in a way that is entirely her own. Her connection to The Simpsons is indirect, mediated through the Beatles references that run through the show's history, through the specific cultural mythology of the late 1960s that the show both honors and gently deflates. She has never appeared in the show, but she has been referenced in ways that engage with the specific and uncomfortable public narrative that has followed her for decades. The narrative that blames her for the dissolution of something that the culture was not ready to let go of. The show's occasional references to Ono are not cruel, but they are reflective of a cultural conversation that has been cruel to her in ways that are worth acknowledging. The mythology of Yoko as disruptive force, as the person who broke something irreplaceable, is a mythology that the show did not create, but that it occasionally borrowed. And the borrowing is less comfortable than most of the show's celebrity material, because the target is someone who has been subjected to decades of cultural punishment for something that the evidence does not support. This is one of the places where the show's tendency to reach for available cultural references without examining their origins creates something less than its best work. It is not malicious, but it is not careful. And the lack of carefulness has a subject who deserved more care. Moby appeared in the show and was treated with the specific, gentle mockery that the show gives to musicians, whose sincerity is genuine but whose public cultivation of that sincerity has generated a specific kind of comedy. Moby's public persona in the early 2000s, built around his veganism and his environmentalism and his opposition to corporate culture, while also being one of the most commercially successful electronic musicians of his generation, contains a contradiction that is funny to look at directly: the specific gap between the stated values and the commercial reality. A gap that Moby himself has been more honest about in the years since than most musicians are. The show finds this gap and makes it the comedy without being mean about it, which is the right approach. The contradiction is real, but it is not evidence of dishonesty. It is evidence of the way that everyone who holds any kind of values while living in a commercial culture inhabits some version of the same contradiction. And Moby's version of it happened to be very public. Let us turn now from the musicians who came to Springfield willingly to the celebrities who came and left with something damaged that had not been damaged before. Let us talk about the refusals, the regrets, the ones who fought back. Section 10. The ones who refused, regretted, and fought back. Not everyone who was invited to Springfield said yes. Not everyone who said yes was happy about it afterward. And not everyone who appeared and seemed comfortable was, in fact, comfortable in the way they appeared to be. The story of the celebrities who refused or regretted their encounters with The Simpsons is, in some ways, more interesting than the story of the successful appearances, because it illuminates something about what the show is asking when it asks a famous person to come to Springfield, and what it costs to give the show what it wants. What the show asks, at its most fundamental level, is for the celebrity to be honest. Not literally honest, not in the biographical sense, but honest in the satirical sense. Willing to be the version of themselves that is true rather than just the version that is flattering. Willing to allow the writers to find the thread that unravels the sweater. Some celebrities are willing to do this. Some celebrities understand it as a reasonable exchange, a temporary diminishment in return for the kind of cultural currency that comes with having been in The Simpsons. Some celebrities find the exercise liberating, the way that laughing at yourself can be liberating, the way that showing the audience you know what they think of you before they have to show you can feel like a form of power. But other celebrities encounter the request and find it genuinely threatening. Find that what the show is asking is not a performance of self-deprecation, but an actual diminishment, an actual reduction that they are not willing to accept because the reduction threatens something they need to protect. Let us start with the most famous refusal in the show's history, one that was not technically a refusal, but functioned as one. Prince was discussed as a potential guest for the show on multiple occasions over the years. Prince was, by any measure, one of the most extraordinary musical figures of the late 20th century. A performer and composer and multi-instrumentalist of such extraordinary ability that his catalog represents one of the most complete visions of what popular music can do that has ever been assembled by a single person. He was also one of the most careful guardians of his own image and his own work, a man who understood that control of the mythology was itself an art form, and who exercised that control with a precision that made him famous for his refusals as much as for his music. Prince never appeared on The Simpsons. This is not surprising. Prince's specific form of celebrity built on the idea of mystique, on the power of withholding, on the specific authority that comes from being consistently unavailable, is fundamentally incompatible with the show's mechanism. The show works by bringing the famous down to Springfield's level, by placing them in a world where fame does not confer special status, where a rock star can sit in Moe's bar and drink a beer and be nobody. The show requires the celebrity to accept, at least temporarily, that their fame is not transcendent, that it is a product, that it can be borrowed and returned. Prince did not accept this. Prince's entire professional life was built on the refusal to accept it. The mystique required distance, required the suggestion that there was something behind the public persona that the public could not access, could not reduce, could not make funny. Springfield does not allow for things that cannot be reduced. And Prince, who had built something irreducible, stayed away. There is a Prince joke in the show, a brief reference to his specific legal relationship with his own name during the period when he changed it to an unpronounceable symbol. The show uses this as comedy in the specific way that everyone used it as comedy, which is to note that the gesture is both genuinely eccentric and genuinely symbolic of something real about the power dynamics of the music industry and the specific battles that artists fight over the ownership of their own work. But the joke is brief and peripheral. The real Prince, the full and complicated and extraordinary person, never entered Springfield. And Springfield is slightly smaller for his absence. Bob Dylan is another absence that says something. Dylan has never appeared on the show, and like Prince, his absence is a statement. Dylan's specific form of celebrity is built on the idea that he cannot be pinned down, that every time you think you know what he is, he changes, that the attempt to define him is itself a kind of category error. The The show that finds the essential version of a person and plays it has nothing to grab with Dylan because Dylan's essential version is the refusal of essence. Frank Sinatra never appeared on the show during his lifetime, though references to him and his mythology are woven through the show's text in various ways. The Rat Pack era, the Las Vegas of the mid-20th century, the specific quality of a certain kind of masculine performance of cool, these are things the show has engaged with in various episodes. But Sinatra himself, who was still alive for the show's first 8 seasons, did not come to Springfield. The reason, almost certainly, is the same reason as Prince and Dylan, that Sinatra's specific form of celebrity was built on an authority that is incompatible with the show's democratic tendency to make everyone in Springfield equally small, equally human, equally subject to the gentle deflation that the show practices. You do not deflate Frank Sinatra, not because he is above deflation in any moral sense, but because the deflation does not take hold. The mythology is too thoroughly constructed, too deeply embedded in the culture, too associated with a specific version of American masculine authority that the culture had spent decades investing meaning in. The joke does not work. The sweater does not unravel. The regrets are a different category from the refusals. Where the refusals are about saying no before the encounter, the regrets are about saying yes and then discovering that the exchange was not what you expected. The most publicly documented regret in the show's history belongs to a musician who appeared and later expressed discomfort with how the episode turned out. The specific details vary depending on who is telling the story, and the show's producers have their own version that differs somewhat from the celebrity's version. But the basic shape of the story is this. Someone came to Springfield expecting one kind of engagement and found another, found that the joke was sharper than they expected or pointed in a direction they had not anticipated, and left feeling that something had been taken from them that they had not agreed to give. This kind of regret is built into the nature of what the show does. When you come to Springfield, you hand the writers a version of yourself, and they do with it what they do, and you cannot fully anticipate in advance what that will be. The script, when it arrives, is the script the writers need for the episode they are making, not necessarily the script that makes the celebrity feel celebrated. George Takei appeared in the show in a later season and has spoken about his experience positively, as a piece of self-deprecation that he participated in fully and found genuinely enjoyable. His appearance, which plays with his association with Star Trek, and with the specific cultural status of a figure who was famous primarily in the 1960s and whose fame had a second life through his wit and accessibility on social media in the 21st century, is one of the show's warmer encounters with someone whose specific kind of celebrity carries its own history. Jerry Springer appeared in an episode and handled the experience with the specific kind of resilience that comes from being someone who has built a career on controlled chaos, who is so comfortable with the unpredictable and the absurd that a half hour of animated satire barely registers as challenging. The case of Kim Kardashian is interesting because of the specific kind of celebrity she represents and the specific way the show handles it. Kardashian appeared in the show in a later season, in a period when her particular form of fame was at its cultural peak, when the Kardashian family had become a media phenomenon that the culture was simultaneously fascinated by and uncertain how to evaluate. The show's handling of Kardashian is less incisive than its handling of some earlier celebrity guests, not because the writers did not find the comedy, but because the specific comedy available about Kardashian, about the specific kind of fame for fame's sake that she represented, is a comedy that requires engaging with questions about value and celebrity and the media's role in creating both. And the show in its later seasons is less comfortable with those bigger questions than it was in its earlier ones. The later seasons of The Simpsons, which is to say roughly seasons 15 through the present, are the seasons during which the show's relationship with celebrity has become most complicated. In the early and middle seasons, the guest appearances were events, special episodes built around specific celebrities, in ways that used the celebrity as the organizing principle of the comedy. In the later seasons, celebrity guests appear more frequently and are often less fully integrated into the episodes they inhabit, more likely to be used as decoration rather than as essential components of the comedy. This shift reflects something real about the changing nature of celebrity itself. In the early 1990s, when the show was at its peak, celebrity was still organized around a relatively small number of people with very large cultural footprints. The famous were famous in a way that was legible and specific. By the 2000s and especially the 2010s, the proliferation of platforms and the democratization of attention had fragmented the celebrity landscape into something much less legible. There were more famous people, each less famous than the famous people of an earlier era, each occupying a smaller piece of the cultural imagination. This fragmentation makes the show's mechanism harder to operate. The reduction works best when the original is known clearly enough and widely enough that the reduced version is obviously a reduction. When the celebrity is famous enough that the joke is instantly readable, that the audience can see exactly what is being compressed and why it is funny. As celebrity becomes more fragmented, as the famous become known to smaller and more specific audiences, the compression becomes less clean. The jokes require more setup. The shorthand that the show relies on is no longer available. The show has adapted to this, imperfectly, in the way that long-running shows always adapt to changing conditions, with some successes and some failures, and a general sense of effort that is not always equivalent to achievement. But before we get to the show's current relationship with fame, let us spend time with the celebrities who came to Springfield and left as legends, the people for whom the encounter with the show was not a compromise or a reduction, but an expansion, a deepening, a moment when the gap between their public image and their actual humanity was bridged rather than exploited. Let us talk about the ones who became more themselves by being in Springfield. Section 11. The ones who became legends. There is a specific subset of Simpsons guest appearances that the show's fans return to with a particular kind of affection. An affection different from the enjoyment of a good joke or the pleasure of a clever satire. This affection is warmer and more personal. It is the affection you feel for a piece of work that accomplished something unexpected, that did what art is supposed to do, which is to make the world feel more real, more complex, more human than it did before you encountered it. These are the celebrity appearances that did not merely use the celebrity, but somehow found the person inside the celebrity and let that person be present in the show for a few minutes. The appearances that are not about the famous thing being famous, but about the human being inside the famous thing being human. We have already talked about Johnny Cash and the Coyote, which belongs in this category, absolutely. We have talked about Phil Hartman, who lived so deeply inside his Springfield characters that the distinction between the voice and the character ceased to matter. We have talked about the McCartney appearance and the specific commitment that Paul brought to a principle rather than a performance. But there are others. Let us move through them slowly and with care, because they deserve it. Let us begin with Linda Ronstadt. Linda Ronstadt appeared in the show in the 4th season, in the episode Mr. Plow, which aired in November of 1992. She played herself, or rather she played a version of herself that the episode deployed as a brief but precise joke about the specific dynamics of celebrity and commercial endorsement. Homer becomes a successful snowplow operator, and his minor local fame culminates in a commercial featuring Linda Ronstadt, which is played as the absurd pinnacle of a very small amount of success. The comedy here is not about Ronstadt specifically. She is not the subject of any particular joke about her career or her reputation. She is used as a marker of a certain level of fame, a level that is real and significant but also reachable, the kind of celebrity that is available to someone like Homer if he is just successful enough at the right moment. It is a gentle, affectionate use of her presence. But the reason the appearance is worth discussing is what it says about Ronstadt's willingness to be that marker, to allow herself to be the symbol of a certain level of reachable fame in a joke about a fat yellow man who drives a plow truck. There is a specific generosity in accepting that role, in understanding that the joke requires you to be both genuinely famous and also available to be borrowed for someone else's story. Ronstadt's career, which includes some of the most precisely performed popular music of the 1970s and early 1980s, and which was significantly affected by her development of Parkinson's disease in the years following her prime, is a story of genuine artistry. Coming to Springfield to be Homer's commercial partner is not the story of her career, but it is a small, warm piece of her public life, preserved in the show's amber, exactly as it was on the day it was made. Tony Hawk appeared in the show in a later season, and was handled with the specific affection that the show gives to athletes whose fame is built on something genuinely remarkable rather than simply on competitiveness. Hawk's achievement in skateboarding, the specific and almost impossibly difficult series of tricks that he had mastered, and that had made him famous outside the relatively small world of professional skateboarding, is the kind of achievement that the show treats with genuine respect, while also finding the comedy in the surrounding mythology. The surrounding mythology of skateboarding in the late 1990s and early 2000s, the specific culture of extreme sports and its associated marketing, and its particular claims about freedom and authenticity and youth, is exactly the kind of thing the show is good at gently deflating. The deflation of the mythology is not the deflation of the achievement. Hawk actually did the 900. That is real, and it cannot be taken away. But the way the culture turned that achievement into a product, the specific machine that turned skateboarding into a lifestyle brand, that is something the show can examine with honest comedy. Hawk participates in this examination with evident good humor, which is one of the things about his public persona that has made him genuinely beloved beyond the skateboarding world. He has always been willing to be the joke as well as the achievement, to acknowledge that the culture made something out of his work that is different from the work itself, and to find that distinction more funny than threatening. Albert Brooks appeared in the show several times, voicing a character named Hank Scorpio in an episode from the 8th season that has become one of the most beloved in the show's entire run. What Brooks brings to this appearance is a specific quality of comedic intelligence that elevates everything around it. He plays Scorpio, who is a supervillain who is also the best boss Homer has ever had, as a figure of extraordinary warmth and enthusiasm whose specific form of evil is essentially unreadable as evil to Homer because it is accompanied by such genuine and infectious positivity. Brooks is not playing himself in this appearance. He is playing a character, but the qualities he brings to the character, the specific intelligence and the particular comedic timing, and the ability to make warmth and menace exist simultaneously without resolution, are so distinctly his that the character and the performer become inseparable. Hank Scorpio is Albert Brooks the way Troy McClure is Phil Hartman, which is to say completely and without remainder. The Hank Scorpio episode is called You Only Move Twice, and it is consistently cited as one of the greatest episodes the show has ever produced. The specific comedy of a man who is simultaneously the best person Homer has ever worked for, and a genuine threat to global stability. The comedy of Homer being too happy to notice that his employer is in the process of conquering the east coast of the United States is a comedy that requires an actor of Brooks's specific gifts to make work. The warmth has to be real. The menace has to be real. Neither can win over the other. Brooks makes both real. That is the performance. That is what a great comedian can do that a merely good comedian cannot. Kelsey Grammer appeared in the show as a character named Sideshow Bob, a villain who recurred throughout the show's run and who became one of its most beloved and most complex figures. Grammer, whose voice is one of the most distinctive in American television, brought to Sideshow Bob the specific quality of a man of genuine culture and intelligence, who has made a series of increasingly catastrophic decisions, who is too proud to learn from his mistakes, who has convinced himself that his aesthetic superiority to the world around him justifies his crimes. It is a great comedic character, built over decades of appearances, and Grammer's contribution to it goes beyond the voice. He understands the specific comedy of Bob's situation, of being the smartest person in the room who is also the most catastrophically wrong-headed, and he plays it with an investment that never diminishes across 30 years of return appearances. The relationship between Kelsey Grammer and Sideshow Bob is one of the most successful celebrity character fusions in the show's history, alongside Hartman's work on Troy and Hutz. It is the case where the celebrity and the cartoon are so thoroughly merged that speaking of one without the other feels incomplete. Let us talk about the moment the show felt most alive in its engagement with celebrity. The episode that represents the summit of what Springfield can do when it has the right guests and the right material and the right combination of affection and honesty. The episode is Homer's Enemy from the 8th season, and it does not feature a celebrity guest in the traditional sense. Its celebrity is fictional, Frank Grimes, a man who becomes Homer's coworker at the nuclear plant. Grimes is a self-made man in the most rigorous sense, someone who has worked hard for every small thing he has achieved, who has done everything right, who has earned his modest successes through genuine effort and genuine sacrifice. And then he meets Homer. And the presence of Homer, the reality of Homer's comfortable and unearned life, The fact that Homer's complete disregard for effort and responsibility has not prevented him from having a loving family and a decent home and a job he cannot logically have retained for 5 minutes breaks something in Grimes that cannot be repaired. The episode is not about a celebrity, but it is about celebrity. About the difference between the person who deserves recognition and the person who receives it. About the way that the culture's distribution of rewards has no reliable relationship with the distribution of merit. About what it feels like for someone who has earned everything the hard way to watch someone else receive everything the easy way. Frank Grimes is the non-celebrity in a show full of celebrities. He is the person for whom merit was supposed to matter and was consistently shown not to. He is the straightest possible man in the funniest possible world, and the world destroys him for it. Not maliciously, not with intent, simply by being what it is. The episode is considered by many critics to be the finest piece of television The Simpsons ever produced. It is not a comfortable episode. It does not end well. It does not provide the kind of resolution that normally closes a Simpsons episode, the reset that allows the world to continue as though nothing happened. Frank Grimes dies, and the world continues as though nothing happened, which is itself the most devastating beat in the episode. What this episode tells us about celebrity is this: that the culture's attention is not a reward, that fame is not justice, that the people who deserve to be seen are often not seen, and the people who are seen often do not deserve it. And that Springfield, which appears to be a place of comedic K, is actually a place of very consistent and very real injustice. An injustice that is not dramatic or visible. An injustice that simply is. The celebrity appearances that have made The Simpsons a cultural institution are the ones that understood this. That understood that the show was not simply asking them to be funny, or to be themselves, or to be present. It was asking them to be honest, in the specific way that Springfield demands honesty, which is completely and without flattery and without the comfortable fictions that fame usually provides as insulation against reality. The ones who gave the show that honesty, who came to Springfield and let themselves be seen in the Springfield way without the armor of their mythology, became more themselves by being there. They left with something they did not bring with them, the specific and strange gift of having been reduced and found still present, still real, still recognizable as human beings, even inside a world of yellow skin and 4 fingers. These are the legends, not the most famous guests, not the most commercially successful, the ones who understood what the show was for and gave it what it needed and were the better for the giving. Section 12. What it all means, or the nightlight of Springfield. We have been in Springfield for a long time now, long enough to have walked every street and sat in every diner and watched the power plant's cooling towers from every angle, long enough to have met everyone who has passed through, the famous and the magnificent and the tragic and the complicated, and to have understood, a little better than we did before, what it means to be seen by this particular town. Let us settle in for this last part. Let us let the thoughts move slowly. Let us go somewhere gentle. What does The Simpsons and celebrity tell us in the final accounting? What has this long and careful examination of the famous people who entered Springfield and what happened to them there actually revealed? The first thing it reveals is that the show is, at its core, a defense of the ordinary against the extraordinary. Not in the anti-intellectual sense, not in the sense that ignorance is good or that achievement does not matter, but in the specific sense that fame does not confer superiority, that the machinery of celebrity does not produce better people, only more visible ones. Springfield is full of celebrity, but Springfield's celebrities receive no special treatment from the universe. They still have to buy groceries and get stuck in traffic and deal with the specific indignities of being alive in a body in a world that does not care about their fame. This is the essential gift of the show's celebrity encounters, not the jokes at the famous person's expense, not the reduction of the mythology to something manageable, but the suggestion, implicit in every appearance, that famous people are also just people, that they feel what people feel, that they want what people want, that under the specific and elaborate machinery of their public lives, they are trying, like everyone in Springfield, to get through the day with enough left over to feel that it was worth it. This sounds simple. It is simple. The best truths usually are. But it is worth remembering, in a culture that has become increasingly organized around the production and consumption of celebrity, in a culture that has normalized the treatment of other human beings as content, that simplicity. Worth remembering that the person in the cartoon, the person reduced to yellow skin and four fingers and the essential joke of their public self, is also the person who went home after the recording session and made dinner and called their mother and wondered whether they had made the right choices. Springfield knows this. Springfield has always known this. It is one of the things that makes Springfield, for all its impossibility and its strangeness and its quietly catastrophic nuclear contamination, a place that feels more honest about human life than most places you can visit. The celebrities who came here and gave the show what it needed, who handed over the essential truth of themselves and let the animators make it funny, receive something in return that you cannot buy with fame. They received the specific and permanent kind of attention that art provides. They were seen, honestly and fully, and in the particular way that lasts. Johnny Cash is still walking in a dream desert, guiding a confused man toward his family. Phil Hartman is still introducing himself as someone you may remember. Michael Jackson is still helping a father write a birthday song for his daughter. And Elizabeth Taylor is still saying her one word, soft and sure and carrying everything that a word like that can carry, in the quiet of a baby's voice in a world that does not age. That is what Springfield does to the famous. It gives them something simpler and more permanent than fame. It gives them a moment of truth, preserved in amber, watched and rewatched for decades, accessible to anyone who wants to visit. And the lights outside your window, wherever you are, whatever time it is, whatever season is happening in the place where you are resting tonight, those lights belong to Springfield too, in a way. Because you have been here with us, you have been walking these streets, and Springfield is the kind of place that, once you have been here, is always a little with you. Get some rest. Springfield will be here when you wake up. It always is. That is the whole point. End of script. Expansion. Additional depth, woven into existing sections. The following material expands each section with deeper storytelling, additional celebrity encounters, more cultural context, and the kind of slow, ruminative narration that makes long-form content hold together across hours of listening. Expanding Section 2. The full Michael Jackson story. To fully understand what Michael Jackson's appearance in The Simpsons meant, you have to understand what Michael Jackson was in 1991. Not just what he had accomplished, though we covered that. What he was in the specific cultural texture of that moment. What it felt like to be alive in America in 1991 and to have Michael Jackson as a fixture of the cultural landscape. There is a kind of fame that exists above the ordinary category of fame the way a mountain exists above the ordinary category of hills. It is not simply that more people know the name. It is that the name carries a different kind of weight. It is that the name spoken in a room changes the room. Michael Jackson in 1991 was that kind of famous. The kind that children grow up knowing before they can explain why. The kind that crosses languages and borders and ideological divisions and lands the same way in every context. Universal in the specific sense that very few things are actually universal. He had been famous since he was 9 years old. He had been photographed and analyzed and discussed and adored since before he was old enough to have formed the specific self that the culture was responding to. The Jackson 5 had introduced him as a child prodigy, as a small boy with an enormous voice and an almost frightening precision of movement. And the culture had reacted to this child with a level of attention that no child is built to receive or to process. What he became, the Michael Jackson of Thriller and Bad and Off the Wall, was partly the product of genuine and extraordinary talent, and partly the product of what happens to a person when they have been at the center of enormous public attention from the beginning of their conscious life. The persona that the world saw, the sequin iron glove, and the single white sock, and the moonwalk, and the specific and unmistakable quality of his dancing and his voice was a construction. All personas are constructions, but his was built under conditions that were unusual in the specific sense of being built in public, from childhood, without the private formation period that most people have to develop a sense of who they are before the world starts telling them who they are. The crayon in Homer's brain is a metaphor for the way that childhood damage shapes adult limitations. Michael Jackson's childhood is a different version of the same story. What happens to a person who becomes famous before they know themselves? What version of a self can be built under those conditions? These questions do not have clean answers. They are not the kind of questions that comedy resolves. But they are present in the background of every Michael Jackson story, including the Simpsons story, and they are worth acknowledging because they are part of what makes the story complicated in the way that it is complicated. The decision to pull Stark Raving Dad from circulation was not made casually. The producers discussed it. They weighed the episode's artistic merit, which is real, against the discomfort of continuing to present it as entertainment in the context of the allegations, which is also real. They landed where they landed, and the result is that one of the show's best episodes is also one of its most inaccessible. What this creates, paradoxically, is a kind of underground mythology around the episode, because the episodes that are hardest to find are the ones that people most want to find. The episodes that have been withdrawn are the ones that carry the specific charge of the forbidden, the specific weight of material that the culture has decided is too complicated to simply watch and enjoy. They become artifacts. They become evidence of something. They become the thing that people seek out specifically because they have been told not to seek it out. Stark Raving Dad has become more famous in its absence than it might have been in its continued availability. The act of withdrawing it made it a topic of conversation in a way that routine availability would not have. And the episode itself, when people do find it and watch it, tends to generate responses that are more intense and more thoughtful than the usual response to a classic Simpsons episode, because people are watching it now with the full weight of everything that has happened since 1991 pressing on the experience. The birthday song at the end. The moment when Lisa cries. These things hit differently now than they did in 1991. Not because they are different, because everything around them is different. Because the voice that sings the song carries a history that it did not carry when the episode first aired. Because the gentleness of the performance, the specific quality of warmth that the voice actor brought to the material, is inseparable now from the everything else that that voice now means. Art does not sit still. It absorbs the history of the world that surrounds it. It becomes something different as the context changes, not in itself, but in the experience of it. Stark Raving Dad in 1991 was a beautiful episode about a father and his daughter, and the possibility of love expressed through small, imperfect gestures. Stark Raving Dad now is all of that, and also a document of a specific moment in cultural history, and also a piece of evidence in a much larger and more painful conversation, and also still, underneath all of it, a beautiful episode about a father and his daughter. The show's relationship with Michael Jackson does not end with the episode. The show has referenced Jackson in various ways across its run, not always comfortably, sometimes in the specific idiom of the culture's relationship with his legacy, which has shifted dramatically from uncomplicated adoration to something much more contested and much more painful. There is no clean conclusion to the Michael Jackson and Simpsons story. There is no moment where everything resolves and the meaning becomes clear. There is only the episode, withdrawn and still present. The voice, pseudonymous and unmistakable. The birthday song playing softly somewhere in a version of Springfield that may or may not officially exist anymore. Let us carry that with us, and let us go somewhere slightly less heavy for a while. Expanding Section 3. The Full Rock History. The story of rock music in Springfield is not just the story of specific guest appearances. It is the story of how the show tracked and processed the evolution of popular music over 3.5 decades, how it responded to the specific cultural moments that music generated, and what the musicians who passed through Springfield reveal about the relationship between artistic identity and public mythology. Let us go back to the beginning, to the very first significant moment when the show made rock music a subject rather than just a backdrop. The episode is called Homer's Barbershop Quartet, and it aired in September of 1993 as the premiere of the 5th season. The episode is explicitly a Beatles parody, a story about a barbershop quartet called the B Sharps that Homer forms and that becomes unexpectedly famous before falling apart in ways that mirror the Beatles' trajectory, from early success, through artistic ambition, through interpersonal conflict, to eventual dissolution. The celebrities who appear in this episode are not rock stars, but they are deeply embedded in the mythology of rock. George Harrison appears briefly in a cameo that is played with gentle self-awareness, acknowledging the Beatles' connection with the kind of wry grace that Harrison specifically had in abundance. Harrison's participation in the joke about a group that represents his own band is an act of genuine generosity and genuine humor. The act of a man who is comfortable enough in his own history that he can afford to lend it to someone else's comedy. Harrison's appearance in the show is one of those moments that becomes more poignant over time. He died of lung cancer in November of 2001, and the episode that features his brief, warm, self-deprecating cameo is now a piece of his legacy, a small and gentle moment of humor preserved alongside the more obviously significant parts of what he left behind. Springfield keeps him as he was, the wry smile, the brief acknowledgement of the joke, the specific grace of someone who has made peace with his own mythology. The Beatles' connection runs through the show's history in various forms. References to Beatles songs and Beatles mythology appear regularly in the background of episodes and sometimes in the foreground, as a kind of cultural shorthand for a specific kind of artistic ambition and a specific kind of tragedy, the tragedy of something extraordinary that could not sustain itself. The show uses the Beatles the way the culture uses the Beatles, as a symbol of what it looks like when everything aligns, when the talent and the moment and the chemistry and the ambition all converge at the same place at the same time, and as a symbol of the specific and irreversible way that such alignments end. Ringo Starr appeared in the show in the third season in an episode called Brush with Greatness, which aired in April of 1991. Marge has painted a portrait of Ringo when she was a teenager, a portrait that she sent to him with a fan letter that he never answered. The episode is partly about artistic ambition and partly about the specific quality of parasocial relationships, the kind of feeling that fans develop about people they have never met and will likely never meet. The specific intimacy of listening to someone's music or watching their performances over years and developing a sense that you know them. Ringo's appearance is used to close this loop, to provide Marge with a moment of genuine acknowledgement, to have the real person finally respond to the young woman who drew his picture decades ago. The show handles this with a sincerity that is unusual for it. It does not make Ringo the joke. It does not reduce his celebrity or his significance or the meaning of his music in Marge's life. It simply has him be kind in the specific and genuine way that acts of belated kindness can be. And the episode earns the warmth of that kindness because it has spent the whole of its running time establishing how much that kindness would mean. Ringo Starr came to Springfield and was not destroyed by it. He came in, did something genuinely touching, and left with the episode's affection following him out the door. Lou Reed's connection to The Simpsons is worth discussing because it illustrates something about the show's relationship with the more resistant edges of popular music, with the tradition that positioned itself explicitly against the mainstream and found its celebrity in that opposition. Reed, who spent 50 years making music that was sometimes difficult and sometimes beautiful and sometimes both at once, was a figure whose specific kind of fame was built on the refusal of the mechanisms that the show's more mainstream guests had employed to reach their audiences. The show engaged with this tradition, the tradition of downtown New York art rock, of the Velvet Underground and its descendants, primarily through cultural reference rather than through direct celebrity encounter. The tradition is present in the show's world as a kind of background radiation, a set of cultural coordinates that educated writers in the 1980s and 1990s inevitably carried around with them, but it is not the tradition from which the show's most direct celebrity engagements came. This is itself an observation worth making. The celebrities who came to Springfield most readily were the ones whose fame was built on the largest possible commercial scale. The artists who maintained a specific relationship with the underground, who defined their identity at least partly through their resistance to the machinery of mainstream celebrity, stayed away. Not entirely, but predominantly. The underground understood that to enter Springfield was to accept a certain kind of mainstream embrace, and some artists found that embrace incompatible with the identity they had built. Bob Mould of Husker Du and Sugar appeared briefly in the show at one point, and his appearance is interesting precisely because of the incongruity, because Mould was one of the foundational figures of American alternative rock, someone whose work was enormously influential on the musicians who would become the mainstream acts of the 1990s, but who himself remained at the margins of mainstream recognition. Springfield, which absorbed so much of the mainstream, received Mould's brief visit as a kind of curiosity, a recognition that the people who shape the culture that shape the culture are not always the most visible people in the room. The grunge episode, which we touched on in the Homerpalooza discussion, deserves more careful attention, because grunge represents a specific kind of rock mythology that the show was uniquely positioned to comment on at the moment of its ascendance. Grunge arrived in the cultural mainstream between 1991 and 1993 with the velocity and the disorienting effect of something that the mainstream had not prepared for. The bands that made up the Seattle scene, Nirvana and Pearl Jam and Soundgarden and Alice in Chains, had been building a sound for years in venues that the mainstream had not been watching. And when the mainstream suddenly turned its attention in their direction, the encounter between these artists and the machinery of mainstream celebrity was genuinely violent. The violence was ideological as well as commercial. Grunge was built on a set of assumptions about authenticity, about the relationship between the artist and the commercial apparatus of the music industry, that were incompatible with the apparatus's own assumptions about what it was owed. The mainstream wanted to sell grunge. Grunge had built its identity partly on the refusal to be sellable. The encounter produced some extraordinary music and a significant amount of damage. Kurt Cobain's death in April of 1994 happened in the year between the second and third seasons of Homerpalooza's production context. The show, which aired the episode in 1996, was making comedy about a cultural moment that had already contained a tragedy, was already processing something that had ended in a specific and irreversible way. The comedy of Homerpalooza is the comedy of a culture that survived grunge, that took the challenge to its own assumptions and ultimately absorbed it, that turned something that was meant to be resistant into something sellable and then went on selling it after the people who made it were gone. This is not a criticism of the episode. The episode is brilliant, but it is worth understanding the context that the episode exists in, the specific weight of what it was commenting on at the moment of its making. Pearl Jam was discussed for various Simpsons appearances over the years. Eddie Vedder, whose specific form of celebrity was built on a genuine and visible discomfort with the mechanisms of fame, whose ambivalence about his own success was so public and so articulate that it became itself a kind of celebrity feature, was a potentially fascinating Springfield guest who never quite made it through the door. The reason, in retrospect, seems clear. Vedder's specific relationship with fame required that it be uncomfortable, required that it cost something, required that the tension between the scale of his public life and his private values be visible and unresolved. Springfield does not do unresolved tension. Springfield resolves. Springfield absorbs. And for someone whose identity required the maintenance of that specific tension, absorption was not acceptable. This is another version of the Prince problem, though for different reasons. Prince refused the embrace because the embrace would have dissolved the mystique. Vedder would have refused the embrace because the embrace would have dissolved the discomfort. And the discomfort was the point. The musicians who did arrive, the ones who found the embrace acceptable or even desirable, are the ones whose relationship with their own fame was more comfortable, who had found a way to carry their celebrity without it feeling like a weight, who had arrived through various routes at a place where being famous was something they could move inside without it crushing them. Tom Petty came to Springfield and brought with him the specific quality of a man who had spent 30 years being exactly as good as he always said he was, and who had the quiet confidence that comes from that consistency. Petty, whose career is a document of how you survive the music industry by being too good for it to discard without being too grand for it to sell, is one of American rock's most genuinely admirable figures, a musician whose reputation was built entirely on the quality of his work and maintained by the continued quality of his work across decades during which many of his contemporaries were doing demonstrably less good work. The Springfield version of Petty is warm and grounded, and exactly what you would expect from a man who spent his career being warm and grounded. The show gives him the treatment it gives people who do not need to be taken down a notch, which is to say it simply lets them be themselves, allows their personality to speak, finds the comedy in the specific quality of their presence rather than in any gap between the mythology and the reality. Because with Petty there is no gap. The mythology and the reality are the same thing. He was what he appeared to be. He did what he said he would do. He made music as long as he could make it, And when he died in October of 2017, at 66 years old, after a career that had lasted from the mid-1970s to the end of his life, the outpouring of grief from people across every demographic and political division was a response to someone who had genuinely earned the affection of an enormous number of people through nothing more complicated than consistently delivering exactly what he promised. Springfield preserves him as he was when he visited, warm and direct and slightly wry and completely present. That is a good version of anyone to be preserved as. Expanding Section 5. The full Phil Hartman story. There is a specific quality to Phil Hartman's work that becomes clearer in retrospect, in the way that things you love always become clearer when they are gone, and you are trying to understand what it was about them that made them irreplaceable. The quality is generosity, not in the abstract sense of being a nice person, though by all accounts he was, but in the specific technical sense of what a generous performer does, which is to make the performance about the scene rather than about themselves. To find the contribution that serves the material rather than the contribution that showcases the contributor. To be, in the deepest professional sense, a collaborator rather than a star. This quality is rare in comedy. Comedy tends to attract people whose ambition is to be the funniest person in the room, who have trained themselves from childhood to find the joke and claim it before someone else does. The competitive instinct in comedy is strong and healthy and necessary in certain contexts. But it is also, in certain other contexts, the thing that makes comedy smaller than it could be. The competitive comic makes the scene about themselves. The generous comic makes the scene about the scene. Hartman was the latter. He understood that the best thing he could do in any given moment was to make everything around him more funny, not less. That the comedy was a collective product, and his role was to serve the product rather than to claim it. This is why his work on The Simpsons was so valuable. He was not trying to steal scenes from Homer or Bart or Lisa. He was trying to give them something to play against, to create the specific kind of comic reality that makes everyone else in the scene funnier than they would be otherwise. Troy McClure is funny because of the gap between his cheerfulness and his obsolescence, but he is also funny because the people who interact with him have a specific quality of reaction to draw from. A specific and precisely calibrated version of mild pleasant delusion to respond to. Hartman gave the other characters something real to play against. The Saturday Night Live years, which preceded the Simpsons years and which established Hartman as one of the most versatile and most gifted cast members in the show's history, are worth discussing in the context of understanding what he brought to Springfield. On Saturday Night Live, Hartman developed a reputation for being able to do anything. Any accent, any age, any character type. He was the performer the writers went to when they needed someone to disappear completely into a role, to erase themselves so thoroughly that the audience never saw the actor behind the character. This is a specific and unusual skill. Most performers are always slightly visible inside their performances, always traceable back to themselves. Hartman was not. He became the character in a way that made the original seem not just inaccessible but non-existent. This skill made him invaluable on SNL, where it earned him the nickname The Glue because he held together whatever was around him. And it translated directly to voice acting for The Simpsons, where the ability to disappear completely into a character is exactly what the medium requires. Troy McClure's appearances in the show across the 3rd through 9th seasons establish him as one of the most fully realized recurring characters in the show's world. He appears in film parodies, in educational videos, in civic events, in commercial contexts, in every zone of Springfield's cultural life that the show could find a plausible reason to place a slightly washed-up celebrity. And in every context, he is completely consistent. The cheerfulness never wavers. The references to his past work never become self-conscious or winking. He inhabits his own mythology with absolute conviction. And the conviction is what makes the comedy work. The specific list of projects that Troy has done, the films and television programs that he references in his introductions, are themselves miniature jokes about the texture of minor Hollywood careers. There is not just the single note of a celebrity who has peaked. There is specific detail. The educational videos about fire safety, the regional commercials, the direct-to-video sequels, the films with earnest titles that suggest serious ambitions modestly executed. Each detail contributes to a portrait of a specific kind of Hollywood life, The life of someone who has been in the industry long enough to know how it works, and whose work in it has been genuine but not quite sufficient to generate the kind of permanent celebrity that outlasts the career's active period. This is not a mean portrait, it is an honest one, and the honesty is delivered with such evident affection that it does not sting. The show is not laughing at Troy. The show is laughing with something about the nature of celebrity careers and the specific dignity of the person who maintains their sense of self despite the evidence of their situation. Lionel Hutz occupies a different emotional register. Where Troy's comedy is about a gentle and persistent self-deception, Hutz's comedy is about a more urgent and more chaotic form of professional confusion. Hutz believes in himself the way Troy believes in himself, but Hutz's belief is more frequently and more directly tested by reality, because Hutz is in the business of solving other people's problems, and his failure to solve them has consequences for people other than himself. The comedy of Lionel Hutz is the comedy of the legal system's inadequacy for the people who need it most. This is not a gentle comedy. The inadequacy of legal representation for people without resources is a real and serious problem in the real world, and the show knows this, and the awareness of it gives Hutz's comedy a specific kind of darkness underneath the slapstick. He is funny, and he is also the thing standing between Homer Simpson and disaster, which is itself a definition of disaster. Hartman played both registers simultaneously: the comedy and the darkness, the charm and the catastrophe, without straining for either, without signaling to the audience that it should notice the darkness, but also without hiding it, leaving it available for the audience that wanted to find it, while keeping the surface comedy cleanly accessible for the audience that simply wanted to laugh. This is a high level of craft. This is what 30 years of professional performance produces in someone who is paying attention. The weeks after Hartman's death in 1998 were, by accounts from people who were there, genuinely disorienting for the show. The cast had been together for almost a decade. They had built a working language together, a specific way of communicating about the work and about the comedy and about what they were all trying to do. And one of the most essential participants in that language, one of the people who had done more than almost anyone else to establish what the show was and what it sounded like, was suddenly not there. The tribute that the show paid to Hartman was not an explicit tribute. It was an implicit one: the removal of his characters from active service. The decision to leave the space unfilled rather than to fill it with someone else's interpretation. The acknowledgement, built into the structure of the show's ongoing work, that what he had done could not be replaced and therefore would not be attempted to be replaced. This is a form of honoring that is deeper than a dedication card. It is a form of honoring that changes the shape of the work permanently, that acknowledges in the most practical possible terms that what was lost cannot be recovered. Every episode of The Simpsons that has aired since May of 1998 is an episode made in the awareness of that absence. The writers know what they do not have. The other voice actors know what is missing from the room. And the audience that has been watching for 36 years and knows the show's textures and tones as intimately as they know anything about popular culture, the audience knows too. It is there in the background of every episode, the warm and precise and generous voice that is not present, the cheerful and delusional man who is not introducing himself, the accident-prone lawyer who is not losing the case that should have been unlosable. Springfield misses Phil Hartman, not officially, not out loud, but in every room that he would have been in and is not, the absence is palpable and real. Expanding Section 6. More women of Springfield. Let us spend more time with the women who came to Springfield and were genuinely served by the encounter, the women whose appearances represent the show at its most thoughtful and most generous. Meryl Streep's connection to the show runs through her voice work as Bart's short-lived girlfriend, Jessica Lovejoy, in the 7th season episode Bart's Girlfriend. Streep does not appear as herself. She voices a character who is essentially the opposite of the version of herself that the public knows, a manipulative and dishonest child who uses her father's position as the local minister to avoid the consequences of her behavior. The comedy of having Meryl Streep, the most respected actress of her generation, voice a small, manipulative cartoon child is itself a piece of meta-commentary, a joke about the gap between the public persona of artistic seriousness and the specific, playful willingness to do something completely different. Streep's performance in the episode is committed and funny and displays the kind of specific technical intelligence that characterizes all her work. Even in a cartoon, even as a minor character, even in a role that exists primarily to be the punchline of a joke, she is doing the actual work of voice acting with the full weight of her attention. This is what great performers do. They do not scale their effort to the perceived prestige of the project. They do their best work in every context. The fact that Meryl Streep agreed to voice a character whose behavior is directly antithetical to her own carefully maintained image of integrity and seriousness is its own kind of gift to the show. It is the gesture of someone who understood the transaction the show was offering, who understood that self-deprecation at this level is a form of power rather than a concession of it, and who chose to make the gesture fully rather than partially. Anne Bancroft appeared in the show, bringing with her a specific quality of theatrical authority that translated remarkably well into the voice medium. Bancroft's voice, which carried the weight of decades of stage and screen work, was itself a kind of performance even in casual conversation. And the show found ways to use that quality in the specific and compressed form that animation requires. Glenn Close appeared in the show, playing in a later season a character related to Homer's family history. Close brought to the role the specific intensity that characterized her film work, the quality of absolute commitment to whatever she is doing that makes her presence in any project feel significant. The show used this intensity with the kind of comedic precision that comes from understanding that intensity itself is funny when placed in the right context, that there's a specific comedy in the gap between grand theatrical commitment and small domestic circumstances. Winona Ryder appeared in the show in an episode that engaged with her specific celebrity moment, a moment that was complicated by the public difficulties she was experiencing at the time of the appearance. Ryder had been, in the early 1990s, one of the most significant actresses of her generation, a figure whose specific combination of intelligence and unconventional beauty had made her a symbol of a certain kind of 1990s alternative cultural sensibility. By the time of her Simpsons appearance, her public image had been complicated by events that had generated significant tabloid coverage. The show's treatment of Ryder is notable for what it does not do. It does not reference the difficulties. It does not make them the subtext of the comedy. It simply uses her presence to tell a story that is about the show's own world rather than about her public life. This is a form of respect that the show does not always extend, but that in this case was the right choice, and the right choice in a way that is worth acknowledging. Halle Berry appeared in the show and brought with her the specific quality of someone at the absolute peak of their professional success. Someone who had recently achieved the kind of recognition that careers build toward and rarely reach. Berry won the Academy Award for Best Actress in March of 2002, becoming the first Black woman to do so, and her Simpsons appearance came in the context of that achievement, carrying the specific weight of a historic moment in American cultural life. The show uses her presence with awareness of this weight, not by making it explicitly the subject, but by allowing it to be present in the specific quality of the comedy, in the acknowledgement that the person in the room is someone significant, someone whose achievement has real meaning that extends beyond the specific joke of any given scene. Isabella Rossellini appeared in the show in a way that plays with the specific quality of her celebrity, which is built not just on her acting career, but on the specific mythology of her parentage, on being the daughter of Ingrid Bergman and Roberto Rossellini, on inheriting a portion of two of the most significant careers in the history of European cinema. Rossellini's celebrity exists at the intersection of her own considerable talent and the enormous gravitational pull of her lineage, and the show finds the comedy in this intersection with the gentle precision that it applies to all of its most interesting subjects. Susan Sarandon appeared in the show across multiple appearances and was consistently treated with a warmth that reflects the specific quality of her public persona, the persona of someone who has used their platform for purposes that go beyond the personal and the professional, who has been publicly and consistently committed to positions on justice and equality that have sometimes made their holder targets of the kind of backlash that public figures face when they speak beyond their lane. The show treats this combination, the celebrity who uses their celebrity as a vehicle for something larger, with the specific kind of affection it gives to genuine commitment, to people who mean what they say and are willing to accept the cost of meaning it. It does not make the commitment the joke. It makes the specific texture of the commitment, the particular way that sincerity manifests in a person who has been through enough to know that sincerity has a price, available as the material of a story. And this is ultimately what the best celebrity appearances in the show accomplish. They find the human texture underneath the mythology. They locate the specific and individual quality that makes this person different from any other famous person, the thing that is not transferable, the thing that belongs only to them. And they let that thing be present in Springfield for the duration of the episode, available to be seen. That is what Springfield does at its best to the women who pass through it. It sees them. Not the mythology, not the category, not the specific kind of female celebrity that the culture has decided they represent. Them. The show is not always this good. It falls short more often than it should. But when it succeeds with its female guests, when it manages the combination of honesty and affection, and the willingness to look directly at someone and find what is actually there, the results are among its best work. Expanding Section 7. The full political story. Let us spend more time in the political landscape, because the political story of The Simpsons and celebrity is longer and stranger and more instructive than we have so far traced. Bob Dole appeared in the show's universe, not as a guest, but as a political reference point, as a figure whose specific quality of political earnestness and military service, and particular kind of mid-20th century American conservatism, placed him in a category that the show could engage with, honestly. Dole was never the show's villain. He was the show's other, the representative of a political tradition that the show treated with a specific kind of respectful skepticism, the kind you reserve for people whose positions you do not share but whose integrity you do not question. Ross Perot was different. Perot appeared in the show's cultural universe at a moment when his specific brand of populist political theater was generating enormous public attention and genuine political consequences. His 1992 presidential campaign, conducted on the basis of enormous personal wealth and a series of infomercials that were themselves a new form of political communication, was a cultural event that the show could not ignore. The Perot jokes in the show are some of the most specifically observed political comedy that the show produced in its middle years, built on the specific quality of his public persona, the directness, the charts, the folksy pragmatism, the fundamental strangeness of a billionaire positioning himself as the representative of ordinary people. Arnold Schwarzenegger is a figure who sits at the intersection of celebrity and political life in a way that is almost unique in American history, and the show's engagement with him reflects this unusual position. Schwarzenegger appeared in the cultural landscape of the show at multiple points, first as a film star and then as a politician. And the transition between these two modes of celebrity is itself one of the more remarkable things to have happened in American public life in the early 2000s. The show treats Schwarzenegger's political career with the same mixture of affection and gentle skepticism that it applies to all of its political subjects. It acknowledges the legitimacy of the career while also acknowledging the specific strangeness of the transition, the way that the skills of one kind of performance do not automatically translate to another kind. The showman and the executive require different things from the person who holds the role. And the comedy of the transition is in the moments when the showman instincts conflict with the executive demands. Ted Kennedy appears in the show in various forms across the years, always as a figure who carries within him the specific weight of American political mythology, the mythology of the Kennedy family, and its particular place in the cultural imagination, the combination of tragedy and achievement, and the specific quality of the dynasty, the sense that this family has been given everything and lost everything and somehow continued anyway. The show is gentle with this mythology while also being honest about it, finding the comedy not in the tragedies but in the specific and sometimes absurd way that political dynasties operate, in the way that name and legacy function as political currency in ways that have little to do with the specific person who is spending them. Jesse Jackson appeared in the show and was treated with the specific warmth that the show gives to figures whose public life has been devoted to something larger than themselves, to figures for whom celebrity is a vehicle for a purpose rather than the purpose itself. Jackson's specific form of public engagement, built on the tradition of Black American church oratory and deployed in the context of political advocacy and civil rights, is rendered in the show with an affection that acknowledges what it is and where it comes from and what it has accomplished. Al Gore appeared in the show in the later seasons, at a point in his career when his specific form of celebrity had shifted from political to advocacy, from candidate to climate messenger. The show engages with this transition with the specific kind of comedy that it finds a balance in the gap between the political self and the advocating self, in the way that the intensity and the commitment of the advocate can look. From certain angles, like the intensity of someone who has found in a cause the outlet for energies that were previously directed at elections. The show's treatment of Gore is not cruel. It finds the comedy in the specific and sometimes comedically intense quality of his advocacy, while also acknowledging that the subject of the advocacy is real and serious, and that the intensity is proportionate to the urgency of the problem. This is difficult balance. It requires the show to be funny about something, without making the thing itself funny, to find the comedy in the person's relationship to the issue without undermining the issue. The show manages this, imperfectly but genuinely. The political landscape that The Simpsons has navigated across 36 years is a landscape that has changed so dramatically that the show at the beginning and the show at the present are responding to fundamentally different political realities. The satirical target of 1990, the target of a political system that was broadly functional, if always imperfect, is a different target from the satirical target of 2025, a system whose dysfunction has become central rather than peripheral. The show has adapted to this shift, again imperfectly, and the adaptation has required finding new registers of comedy, or abandoning certain registers that no longer work, or finding in the new political landscape the specific human comedy that is always present even in the most apparently incoherent situations. Because here is what the show has always known. What sits underneath all of its political comedy, underneath all of its celebrity comedy, underneath all of its examination of the relationship between ordinary people and the powerful systems that surround them. The comedy is in the humanity. It is always in the humanity. The specifically human quality of people who are trying and failing and trying again, who are motivated by things they do not fully understand, who are performing versions of themselves that are only partially true, who are doing their best in conditions that their best is not quite sufficient to meet. This is what makes Springfield feel true even though it is not real. Not the yellow skin or the four fingers or the impossible geography. The humanity. The specific and universal and endlessly renewable comedy of being a person in a world that does not quite fit. The politicians who came to Springfield and were most successfully rendered are the ones who are willing to be seen in this light, not as representatives of positions or parties or ideologies, but as people, specifically human and specifically limited and doing their best in conditions that their best was only sometimes sufficient to meet. This is what the show has always asked of everyone it has invited inside. Be a person. Just be a person. Stop performing the mythology and start performing the truth. Most politicians find this request extremely difficult. The career requirement of maintaining the mythology is so deeply ingrained that the request to drop it, even briefly, even for comedy, even in animation, can feel like a form of professional suicide. The ones who managed it, who found the Springfield Register and inhabited it fully, are the ones whose appearances still feel alive and real. The others are historical artifacts, evidence of a moment in political history, but not quite the thing the show was reaching for. Expanding Section 8. More sports stars. Let us fill in more of the athletic celebrity landscape, because there are figures we have only briefly touched on who deserve more careful attention. Muhammad Ali is a figure who appears in the Springfield universe not through a direct appearance, but through the specific weight of reference, through the way the show engages with the mythology of his career and what it means. Ali is, by any reasonable measure, one of the 2 or 3 most significant athletic celebrities in American history, and his significance extends so far beyond the specific athletic achievement of boxing that to discuss him primarily as an athlete is to miss most of what makes him important. Ali was famous first for what he could do with his body, and the things he could do were genuinely extraordinary. The speed and the precision and the ability to absorb punishment that seemed designed to create exactly the kind of destruction of the human body that Homer Simpson has been accidentally absorbing for 36 seasons. But Ali became mythological through what he was willing to do with his public life, through the refusal to be drafted, through the conversion to Islam, through the specific quality of his public speech, which combined athletic trash talk with genuine political provocation in a way that had no precedent. The show engages with the Ali mythology primarily through cultural reference, through the specific idiom of sports commentary that invokes his image and his legacy as a standard against which other things are measured. He never appeared in Springfield directly. His absence, like Prince's absence, like Dylan's absence, suggests something about the limit of the show's mechanism with respect to figures who have achieved a kind of cultural authority that resists reduction. Joe Namath appeared in the show and was treated with the specific affection that the show gives to figures whose celebrity exists primarily in the past, who were once at the center of a cultural moment that has receded into history. Namath's Super Bowl guarantee, his specific moment at the intersection of football achievement and counterculture celebrity, is one of the cultural touchstones that the show's writers grew up with. And the appearance has the warmth of people engaging with a piece of their own cultural formation. Reggie Jackson's appearance in the show plays with the specific and somewhat theatrical quality of his baseball celebrity, with the specific quality of a figure who understood from the beginning of his career that the performance was as important as the achievement, that the man and the myth were both products to be managed and deployed. Jackson named himself after candy bars, or candy bars were named after him depending on who was telling the story. He played in New York at the peak of the Yankees' dysfunction and excellence. He was called Mr. October by people who meant it as both a compliment and a description of something more complicated. The show uses Jackson's specific quality of theatrical self-regard with the precision it applies to all figures who understand themselves as performances. Not cruelly, not reductively, but honestly in the specific sense of acknowledging that the performance is real, and the achievement is real, and the combination of them is what makes the person interesting. Kareem Abdul-Jabbar appeared in the show and brought with him the specific quality of a man whose career spans multiple cultural eras, whose achievement is so sustained over such a long period that it almost defies the mechanisms of celebrity, almost because celebrity requires the culture's active attention, and sustained careers can lose that attention in the middle, in the years between the early peak and the late recognition. Abdul-Jabbar's public life after basketball, his advocacy and his writing and his cultural commentary, represents a specific kind of post-athletic celebrity that the show engages with thoughtfully. The athlete who has more to say after the athletic career has ended, who uses the platform that the career created for purposes that the career itself would not have allowed, is a figure the show finds genuinely interesting. This interest reflects something in the show's DNA. Springfield is fundamentally interested in people who are more than one thing, who exceed the categories they have been placed in, who refuse to be only what their most obvious achievement suggests they are. The athlete who writes, the comedian who grieves, the politician who cares, the musician who listens. These are the figures Springfield handles with its best care, because they are the figures who require that care. Wayne Gretzky appeared in the show and was treated with the specific reverence that hockey culture accords to its greatest figure, while also being placed in the show's context with the familiar gentle deflation. Gretzky's specific quality of celebrity, which is built on achievements so far beyond normal athletic parameters that they are genuinely difficult to communicate to people who do not follow hockey, creates an interesting challenge for the show's mechanism. How do you make a joke about someone whose primary cultural marker is statistical dominance, whose fame rests on numbers that are comprehensible only within a specific sporting context? The show finds the comedy not in the achievement, but in the surrounding mythology, in the specific quality of hockey celebrity which has always had a slightly regional and slightly underrepresented character in the broader American sports landscape, in the gap between the scale of what Gretzky accomplished and the scale of the audience that is fully equipped to appreciate it. This is an honest piece of comedy. It acknowledges that certain kinds of excellence are not universally legible, that the culture's distribution of celebrity does not track the distribution of achievement. And it finds in that gap the specific comedy of the world's greatest, anything having to explain themselves to people who do not have the reference points to understand what they are the world's greatest at. Nolan Ryan is another case study in the athletic celebrity that the show handles with particular warmth. Ryan, whose career is one of the most durably remarkable in baseball history, who pitched in the major leagues until he was 46 years old, who threw the baseball harder for longer than anyone before or since, represents a specific kind of Texas athletic mythology that the show finds both affectionate and genuinely funny. The Texas quality, the specific combination of physical toughness and directness, and the particular kind of mild belligerence that is part of Texas cultural identity, is something the show has always been good at rendering. Not as a caricature, not as a stereotype, but as a genuine regional quality that is real and has real comedy available in it. The comedy of a way of being in the world that is so different from the show's own sensibility that the encounter between them generates its own light. Expanding Section 9. The deeper musical buying story. The story of music in Springfield goes deeper than the specific guest appearances we have cataloged. It goes into the structure of the show itself, into the way that music is used as a language in the show's world, as a vehicle for emotion that the characters cannot always access through other means. Homer sings. Not well, but with commitment. He sings advertising jingles and folk songs in his own improvisations on existing melodies. He sings because singing is one of the things that Homer's limited cognitive infrastructure actually supports. One of the forms of expression available to a man whose verbal reasoning is genuinely compromised and whose emotional life is nonetheless rich and real. The use of music in The Simpsons as a vehicle for emotional authenticity is one of the show's deepest and most consistently deployed techniques. When Homer sings, something is communicated that would not be communicated through dialogue. The language of music reaches into emotional territory that Homer's verbal facility cannot access. This is not a limitation specific to Homer. This is true for everyone. The musicians who have passed through Springfield, the ones whose appearances worked, are the ones who understood this. Who understood that the show's use of music is not incidental but structural, that music in Springfield is a form of emotional speech, and that appearing in that context required not just performing their public persona, but offering something of what their music is actually for. Tom Jones, who we mentioned briefly earlier, is worth returning to in this context. Jones's voice is one of those voices that carries a specific emotional charge, a specific quality of physical presence that communicates something through the medium of sound that transcends the lyrics. The thing about a great singer's voice is that it makes you feel something before you have processed what the words mean. The voice itself is the communication, the words are the clarification. When Jones voices himself in Springfield, he brings this quality with him, and the show uses it with the kind of specific attention it brings to all the things that are genuinely extraordinary about the people who pass through its world. The voice is not mocked. The voice is honored. The comedy is around the voice, in the gap between the voice's extraordinary quality and the completely ordinary Springfield context in which it is being deployed. This is the deepest form of affection that the show can express toward a performer. Not to make the performance funny, to let the performance be extraordinary and find the comedy in everything except the performance. Beck deserves a longer discussion in this context because Beck represents something genuinely important about a specific moment in popular music history that the show was uniquely positioned to engage with. Beck arrived in 1994 with a song called Loser that became one of the defining artifacts of its moment. Not because it was a great song exactly, though it was a good one, but because it captured something about the specific emotional register of a generation that had been promised a particular kind of future and was not sure the promise was going to be kept. The song's defining lyric, in the slacker context of its moment, was both sincere and ironic at the same time, both a genuine self-assessment and a performance of self-assessment, and the inability to tell which it was, the blurring of the line between the real and the performed, was exactly what made it resonate. Beck's subsequent career was built on expanding and exploring this blurring. He made music that was simultaneously from every genre and from no genre, that borrowed and recombined and defamiliarized in ways that were genuinely inventive and occasionally genuinely moving. And he did it all with a quality of detachment that was itself a kind of style. The Springfield encounter with this specific quality of celebrity, the celebrity of ironic sincerity, of performance that is also confession, of pastiche that is also original, is one of the show's more interesting navigations. The show that is built on the same principle, the show that is simultaneously a parody and the real thing, that is made with craft and care, and also with the awareness that all craft and care is also a performance, found in Beck, a figure who was operating on similar ground. They were not the same. The show and Beck are not the same kind of thing, but they recognized each other across the specific territory of ironic sincerity, and the show's handling of his appearance reflects that recognition, a quality of understanding that the show does not always bring to its musical guests. Radiohead is worth mentioning because Radiohead never appeared in the show, and the absence is interesting in the same way that Prince's absence is interesting, though for entirely different reasons. By the late 1990s, Radiohead had established themselves as perhaps the most critically significant band working in popular music, a status they have maintained with remarkable consistency for 3 decades. They had also established themselves as a band whose relationship with the machinery of popular music, with celebrity culture, and with the commercial apparatus of the music industry was one of profound and genuine ambivalence. Not the performed ambivalence of a band that wants the benefits of commercial success while maintaining the credibility of anti-commercial posture. Genuine discomfort, genuine uncertainty about what they were doing and why, genuine wrestling with the question of what it means to be a band of this specific kind in a culture of this specific kind. This genuine discomfort is exactly the kind of thing that Springfield cannot quite absorb. The show works by finding the resolution in the comedy, by bringing things down to the level of human scale and finding the humor there. But Radiohead's specific quality is the refusal of resolution, the insistence on sitting with the discomfort, on making the discomfort the music rather than using the music to escape the discomfort. You cannot do this in a half hour of animated comedy. You cannot maintain the productive irresolution that Radiohead requires in a form that demands resolution. The encounter would require either the show to change what it is or Radiohead to change what they are, and neither was going to happen, so the encounter did not happen. Their absence from Springfield is a small but accurate piece of evidence about the limits of what comedy can do with certain kinds of seriousness. Some forms of cultural weight cannot be borrowed for a joke. Some forms of cultural weight require the full medium of their original expression and will not survive translation into any other form. Expanding Section 10. More refusals and regrets. Let us return to the territory of refusal and regret, because there is more to say about both. The category of people who refused is larger than we have indicated. Many celebrities who were approached about appearing on the show declined, and the reasons for their declinations are as varied as the celebrities themselves. Some declined because of scheduling, some declined because the specific episode proposed did not suit them. Some declined because the specific version of themselves that the episode wanted to use was not the version they were willing to offer. Clint Eastwood declined multiple approaches. Eastwood's specific form of celebrity, built over 50 years of a career that spans acting and directing and producing, and a specific and consistent politics, is one of the most thoroughly and carefully maintained in Hollywood. Eastwood does not do things that he does not fully control. He does not offer versions of himself that he has not approved. The show's request, which is always fundamentally a request for a certain kind of vulnerability, for the willingness to be the joke, is a request that Eastwood's entire professional life has been organized against fulfilling. This is not a criticism of Eastwood. It is simply an observation about the incompatibility between what the show needs and what certain kinds of celebrity will offer. Eastwood has built something that is genuinely impressive, a career of consistent artistic ambition and genuine achievement that has lasted across 8 decades. The specific identity that underpins that career requires protection. Springfield would have punctured it, gently but definitively, and Eastwood understood this and chose not to be punctured. Jack Nicholson never appeared. Nicholson, whose celebrity is built on the specific quality of a man who has decided that the best performance of himself is the full, uncensored, maximally expressive version of himself, whose public persona is built on the demonstration that he does not care what you think of him, is actually a figure whose Springfield potential is enormous. The gap between the performed uncaring and the reality of someone who has built an entire career around their image is a comedy waiting to happen. But Nicholson, like Eastwood, has never been willing to make it happen within someone else's frame. His particular performance of himself requires that he control the context. Springfield is not a context that can be controlled. Springfield does what Springfield does. And for someone whose entire professional identity is built on the performance of control, that is an unacceptable risk. Dustin Hoffman actually did appear in the show, in the second season, in an episode called Lisa's Substitute, but he appeared under a pseudonym, credited as Sam Eddick. His voicing of Mr. Bergstrom, the substitute teacher who briefly becomes the most important adult in Lisa's life, is one of the show's finest performances and one of its most genuinely emotional episodes. The episode handles the specific relationship between a brilliant and sensitive child and the adult who finally sees her with a care and a depth that is unusual not just for animation, but for television of any kind. Mr. Bergstrom is not a love interest. He is not a romantic figure. He is a teacher in the specific and most valuable sense, someone who sees a child clearly and communicates that seeing in a way that the child can receive and carry with her. The moment when Lisa, watching her substitute teacher's train depart from the station, reads the note he has left her and finds written on it simply, "You are Lisa Simpson," is one of the most quietly devastating pieces of storytelling the show has ever produced. Because in the context of everything the show has established about Lisa, about her isolation and her frustration and her longing to be seen, those four words, "You are Lisa Simpson," which seem on the surface to be a tautology, are in fact exactly the right thing to say to someone who needs to be told that who they are is enough. Hoffman gave this episode everything it needed. He understood what it was trying to do. He understood that the weight of the episode rested on the specific quality of the relationship between this man and this child, and he brought to the voicing of Bergstrom the full weight of his attention and his craft. The performance is not showy. It is not demonstrating anything about Dustin Hoffman's abilities. It is entirely and completely in service of the story. This is what the best celebrity appearances in The Simpsons are. Not demonstrations of celebrity, acts of service to a story that is larger and more important than the celebrity's participation in it. The pseudonym Sam Eddick is a pun on the word sympathetic, which is itself a piece of evidence about the quality of the writing in the show's early seasons. The teacher who is given this name is the most sympathetic figure the show has ever produced. The name is hidden in plain sight for the audience that is paying attention. Expanding Section 11. More legends. Let us extend the gallery of the legends, the celebrities whose encounters with Springfield produce something more than entertainment. Robin Williams deserves an extended discussion, even though his connection to The Simpsons is more indirect than direct. Williams never appeared in the show itself, though he appeared in the broader Groening universe through other projects. His absence from The Simpsons is interesting because Williams was, in many ways, the ideal Springfield citizen, the figure who most embodied the show's particular combination of manic energy and genuine sadness, of comedy as survival strategy, of the performance of happiness as a response to something more complicated underneath. Williams's comedy, which operated at a speed and a density that was genuinely unusual, which packed more references and more connections and more tonal shifts into a minute than most comedians could manage in an hour, was built on the same principle as Homer's survival. The principle that if you keep moving fast enough, if you keep generating enough material, if you never quite slow down enough for the darkness to catch up, you can stay ahead of it indefinitely. We know now that he could not stay ahead of it indefinitely. We know what the darkness was and what it eventually did. But in the years when he was alive and working, the speed and the generosity and the extraordinary technical facility of his comedy were a kind of wonder. And the show that shared his sensibility, that operated on the same principle of comedy as a response to something more serious, would have been an extraordinary home for him. His absence is the absence of the collaboration that did not happen, and it joins Phil Hartman's absence as one of the permanent losses in Springfield's territory. One of the things that the show contains as a space rather than a presence, as a shape defined by what is not there. George Burns appeared in the show in the second season, in an episode that gave him the role of God, or at least of a figure who claims to be God, which in Springfield amounts to the same thing. Burns, who was in his 90s at the time of the appearance, and who had been performing in American entertainment for literally 70 years, brought to the role of God the specific quality of someone who has survived long enough to develop a relationship with the absurdity of his own continued existence. There is a specific quality to the comedy of extreme old age, when it is handled honestly and without condescension. The comedy of being 90 years old in a culture that is oriented around youth, the comedy of having seen everything and having opinions about all of it that are both extremely specific and extremely outdated, the comedy of having accumulated so much experience that the experience itself becomes a kind of resource that no younger person can access or fully understand. Burns, who was perhaps the greatest practitioner of this specific kind of comedy in the 20th century, brought it to Springfield in the form of a god who has the specific tired wit of someone who has been doing the god job for an extremely long time and finds it less surprising than he used to. James Brown's appearance, which we touched on earlier, deserves more careful attention because Brown represents a specific kind of celebrity that the show handles with the most care. The celebrity whose mythology is built not on the machinery of the entertainment industry, but on something that existed before that machinery and that continues regardless of it. Brown's sound, the specific quality of what he created with his voice and his band, is one of the foundational elements of American popular music of the last 60 years. It is present in hip-hop and R&B and funk and rock and electronic music and every form of popular music that draws on the rhythm tradition, which is to say every form of popular music without exception. He is omnipresent in the DNA of the music that Springfield uses as its emotional language. Putting Brown in Springfield is putting the source of the music in the town that runs on the music, which is a piece of structural self-awareness that the show demonstrates rarely, but always effectively. Brown in Springfield is the root appearing in the plant, the source made visible in the thing it generated. And Brown himself understood this. He was not modest about his influence, which was appropriate because his influence was real. He was not falsely humble. But he was also genuinely funny about himself, about the specific quality of the mythology that had accumulated around him, about the way that the Godfather of Soul persona was a performance that he had built and maintained, and that now had a life somewhat independent of the man inside it. The show uses both things, the genuine influence and the performed mythology, with the precision it brings to its best celebrity work. It honors the achievement without solemnizing it. It finds the comedy in the mythology without diminishing what generated the mythology. It sees Brown clearly, as a person and as an icon, and renders both. David Crosby appeared in the show in the later seasons and brought with him the specific quality of a figure whose celebrity exists in layers, each layer revealing a different version of the same person as you peel it back. The outer layer is the Crosby, Stills, Nash, and Young mythology, the specific moment of late 1960s California rock that placed these musicians at the center of a cultural conversation about war and peace and the possibility of social change through music. The next layer is the personal mythology, the specific and very public difficulties that Crosby went through in the 1980s and 1990s, the substance issues and the legal troubles and the health problems. The next layer is the remarkable recovery and late career renewal, the albums he made in his 60s and 70s that were in some ways his best work. Springfield encounters the outermost layer primarily, uses the cultural shorthand of the era and the sound and the specific image. But the deeper layers are present as context, as the history that gives the outer layer its specific weight. Warren Zevon's connection to The Simpsons is primarily through cultural reference, through the specific quality of his songs, which share the show's sensibility in interesting ways. Zevon was a songwriter whose work was built on a specific combination of black comedy and genuine darkness, who found the comedy in mortality and failure and human limitation, with a precision that felt both funny and true. His most famous song, Werewolves of London, with its combination of absurdist imagery and genuine musical craft, is exactly the kind of thing that operates on multiple levels simultaneously. The level where it is funny, and the level where it is sad, and the level where those things are the same. This sensibility, the sensibility of finding comedy in the darkness without pretending the darkness is not dark, is the sensibility of The Simpsons at its best. Zevon never appeared in the show, but he would have been at home there. He died of mesothelioma in September of 2003, and his last album, The Wind, made while he was dying with the knowledge that he was dying, is one of the most extraordinary pieces of work in the history of popular music. It does what The Simpsons does at its deepest level, which is to find the warmth and the comedy and the genuine human connection in the middle of something that should, by all rights, be nothing but darkness. That is the note on which we want to end this expansion, not with a grand statement or a final conclusion, but with the observation that the thing The Simpsons has always been reaching for, through all of its celebrity encounters and all of its political comedy and all of its examination of fame and power and the human comedy of ordinary life, is the thing that Zevon's last album reached for and found: the warmth in the darkness, the specific and genuine connection between human beings that persists even in the most absurd and the most painful contexts. The knowledge that the people around us, however famous or however ordinary, however yellow-skinned or however familiar, are doing their best in conditions that are always slightly beyond them, and that this effort, this insistence on trying, is itself a form of love. Springfield is love. Not the sentimental kind, the honest kind, the kind that sees clearly and finds the comedy and also finds the warmth, and knows that these are not different things. That is what all these celebrities found when they came to Springfield. Some of them knew what to do with it, some of them did not. But all of them were seen. All of them were rendered in yellow and given 4 fingers, and placed in a world that would not age around them, a world that would preserve them exactly as they were on the day they arrived. And we, the audience, the ones who have been watching from the beginning, the ones who have been in Springfield so long that it feels less like a fictional town and more like a place we actually know, we are part of this too. We are the ones who keep the preservation going. We are the ones who return to these episodes and find the celebrities inside them and understand a little better each time what it meant for them to come here and what it means for us to have watched. Thank you for being here. Thank you for staying. Thank you for watching with the lights low and the blanket pulled up and the world outside going quietly about its business. Springfield will be here when you come back. It always is. End of expansion material. Additional material: the late-era guests and the show's evolving relationship with fame. There is something worth saying about the specific way the show has changed in its relationship with celebrity in the years since its 15th season, roughly the point at which the showrunner rotations, and the changing television landscape and the aging of the original creative team combined to produce a show that was still The Simpsons, but was The Simpsons in a different register, a register that is worth understanding on its own terms, rather than simply measuring against the peak. The late-era Simpsons is a show that exists in a different cultural ecosystem from the show that produced Homer at the Bat and Stark Raving Dad and Homer Palooza. It exists in the ecosystem of peak television, of streaming services and prestige drama, and the specific cultural conversation that occurs when television has elevated itself to the status of the primary artistic medium of its era. In this ecosystem, the animated sitcom that was once at the cutting edge of what television could do is now a legacy institution, a show that has outlasted the era that made it significant and that continues on the basis of its own accumulated weight. The celebrity encounters in this era reflect this shift. They are more frequent in some ways because the late-era show relies on them more heavily than the early show did, which generated its best work from within its own established world. But they are less integrated. They are more often cameos in the traditional sense, famous people passing through for a scene or two rather than anchoring an entire episode. There are exceptions. The show still occasionally produces a late-era celebrity episode that has the quality of the best early work, that uses a famous person's presence as the organizing principle of genuine comedy, rather than as a decoration on top of it. These episodes remind the audience that the mechanism still works, that the essential capability that made the show great is still available to it, and that the difference between the best episodes and the lesser ones is not age or exhaustion, but attention. Lady Gaga's appearance in the 23rd season is one of these exceptions. The episode, titled Lisa Goes Gaga, is built around the encounter between Lisa Simpson and a figure who represents a specific version of the message that Lisa has always needed, the message that extraordinary creativity and genuine difference are not impediments to connection, but paths toward it. Gaga's specific public mythology, the theatrical self-invention, and the explicit embrace of those who have been excluded and othered, is exactly the mythology that the episode needed. The appearance is not subtle. Gaga's public persona is not subtle, which is itself the point, which is itself what makes her useful to this particular story. She brings the full scale of her public self into Springfield, and the comedy and the warmth come from the specific encounter between that scale and Springfield's particular variety of the ordinary and the small. Gaga voiced herself with complete commitment, which is her only mode. She does not do things by halves. And the episode, which has been criticized by some fans for being too sentimental and too directly promotional, is actually one of the show's most honest explorations of the relationship between celebrity and the ordinary people who need something from it, who look at someone like Gaga and see in her flamboyance permission to be themselves, who find in the scale of her self-expression a kind of normalization of their own smaller but equally genuine sense of being different. Springfield received Gaga and let her be what she is, which is itself a form of respect. The show did not reduce her. It borrowed her full scale and applied it to Lisa's story, and the application worked. Ricky Gervais appeared in the show and brought with him the specific and somewhat divisive quality of his public persona. The persona of someone who is genuinely funny and genuinely intelligent, and who has built a public self around the performance of not caring what you think of him. A performance that, as with all such performances, is most interesting when it slips and the caring is briefly visible. The show handles Gervais' specific quality with the precision it brings to people who are doing something complicated, who are holding multiple things at once, multiple performances of themselves, multiple registers of their public identity. The comedy of Gervais and Springfield is the comedy of recognizing a fellow performance, of two things that are both performances and both real existing in the same space and acknowledging each other. Ed Sheeran appeared in the show, and the appearance, while pleasant, represents the show at its most cameo-dependent, its most willing to use celebrity presence as a substitute for the kind of comedy that celebrity presence in the best episodes was only the vehicle for. Sheeran is likable and willing, and his specific form of pop celebrity, built on earnestness and emotional directness and a specific kind of vulnerability that is both genuine and commercially cultivated, sits slightly awkwardly in the Springfield context, because it is the kind of earnestness that the show's mechanism has difficulty engaging with fully. The show respects earnestness when it finds it, as we saw with the McCartney appearances and with the Johnny Cash episode. But it respects it best when the earnestness has been tempered by something else, when it exists alongside a self-awareness that allows the show to find the comedy without dismantling the sincerity. Sheeran's specific kind of earnestness is less complicated by self-awareness than the show needs, which makes the encounter slightly flat, pleasant, but not resonant. Elon Musk appeared in the show, and the appearance, made before the specific circumstances of his public life had shifted dramatically in the cultural conversation, represents the specific challenge of engaging with a figure whose public mythology was in rapid and visible transition. Musk, at the time of his appearance, occupied a specific place in the cultural imagination, the place of the entrepreneur visionary, the person who has made the future seem not just possible but imminent. And the show engaged with this mythology with the standard, gentle deflation that it applies to all large public mythologies. The subsequent history of Musk's public life has made the appearance read differently than it did at the time, in the specific way that several other celebrity appearances we have discussed have come to read differently as the celebrities themselves have changed. Springfield preserves the moment of the appearance, freezes it at the specific cultural temperature of that day, and the contrast between that frozen moment and the subsequent heat of the cultural conversation around the subject is itself a form of information about the nature of public mythology and how quickly it can shift. This is ultimately one of the most interesting things that the show provides as a cultural document. Not just the appearances themselves, but the way time acts on them. The way that Springfield's eternal present creates a kind of perpetual before for every celebrity whose life has subsequently changed, a preserved version of who they were at the moment they entered the show, unchanging and accessible, waiting to be compared with whoever they have become since. Springfield is the record. It is the permanent record of who all these people were when they passed through it, in the version of themselves that they were willing or able to offer to the show's gentle examination. And the record does not update. The record stays exactly as it was. Every celebrity who has ever been in Springfield is still there, in some episode, on some server, accessible to anyone who wants to find them. Still yellow, still four-fingered, still reduced to their essential public form, And placed in a world where nobody ages and nobody changes, and the lights are always on and the beer is always cold and Homer is always coming home from the plant just in time for the couch and the television and the family. This is what Springfield offers. Not destruction exactly, though it destroys pretension with remarkable efficiency. Not celebration exactly, though it celebrates the human and the ordinary with remarkable warmth. Something in between, something that is honest about what fame is and what people are, that holds both together without resolving them into each other. Fame is a performance. People are real. The people who perform fame are both. Springfield knows this and says so gently in every single episode, with every single guest who has ever walked through its doors. And the guests, the ones who heard what Springfield was saying and gave themselves to it fully, who let the show find the essential truth of them and render it in yellow, those guests are preserved in Springfield's amber in a way that ordinary fame does not preserve anything. More honestly, more completely, more permanently, more human. Final note for the 11 Labs narrator. This script is designed to be read slowly and warmly, with natural pauses between paragraphs. Commas should guide breath rather than speed. The transitions between celebrities should feel like moving through rooms in a familiar house. The emotional moments, particularly the Phil Hartman section and the Michael Jackson conclusion, should be given time. Do not rush them. Let the silence work. The opening and the closing should feel like settling in and like letting go, respectively. The listener is going to sleep. Take them there gently. Be the voice in the quiet room. Be the story in the dark. End. One last thing before you go. There is one final celebrity whose relationship with The Simpsons deserves mention, not because of a specific appearance, but because of what she represents in the context of everything we have been discussing. Lily Tomlin has appeared in the show in various contexts across its run and represents a specific kind of American comedic celebrity that is worth spending a moment with. Tomlin's career, which spans from Laugh-In in the late 1960s through decades of stage and film and television work, and which continues in the present with a vitality that is itself a form of comment on the nature of creative longevity, is built on a specific and unusual foundation. The foundation of character work that is simultaneously satirical and deeply empathetic. Tomlin's characters, the ones she has created and inhabited over 50 years of performance, from Ernestine the telephone operator, to Edith Ann the child philosopher, to the endless gallery of figures she has assembled through her career, are all built on the same principle. They are found with their defenses down. They are approached with enough affection that they do not feel the need to perform anything other than themselves. And in the space of that affection and that honesty, they reveal something about the human condition that could not be revealed any other way. This is the Springfield principle. This is what the town has always been doing with its celebrity guests, whether the guests knew it, or understood it, or were comfortable with it, or were not. Tomlin knew. She understood it from the beginning because she had been doing the same thing in her own work for decades before the show existed. When she came to Springfield, she came as someone who already spoke the language, who already knew that the honest and the funny are the same thing, who already understood that the most generous thing you can offer a subject is to see them clearly and to make that clarity the comedy rather than the cruelty. She and the show were, in the deepest sense, colleagues. They were in the same business, the business of finding people at their most human, and letting that humanity be the story. That is the business of all the best art. Not the packaging, not the performance, the finding. And Springfield, this impossible yellow town, on no map in no state with its cracked cooling towers, and its immortal billionaire and its family that will not age and its fish with too many eyes, has been in that business since December 17th, 1989. 36 years, 788 episodes, hundreds of celebrities, thousands of characters, millions of moments, all of it in service of the same simple and endlessly renewable truth. People are funny because people are real. The comedy and the love are the same thing. And the best way to honor someone, famous or ordinary, celebrity or civilian, is to see them honestly and let them be seen. Springfield sees you. It always has. Rest now. You have been here a long time and it is quiet and warm and the lights are going low. Springfield will be here when you wake up. The couch is always there. The family is always home. And somewhere in the middle distance, just past the power plant and the gorge and the first star of Springfield's evening, Homer is always making his way back toward the house on Evergreen Terrace. He always makes it home. That is the whole point. Good night.